Started, let me first introduce Dr. Jennifer Grace Bird. She is a biblical scholar. This is not her first time at the rodeo either. She's been around the loop. Okay.
Time or two.
You're not just getting somebody's opinion that you found on TikTok. This is an actual biblical scholar. So you could, even if you ignore everything I say, let's, 'cause I'm nobody, right? I'm just a guy on TikTok.
Just a guy, yeah.
Let's give Dr. Bird some respect here. Um, so Dr. Bird, I've listened to some of your interviews elsewhere, and so I got a little bit a taste of your background. But I have lots of questions, and I think a lot of people watching this they're really going to enjoy your experience deconstructing, or at least hearing about your deconstruction experience. Yours, I want to say, has a lot of elements that maybe mine didn't have, which is really intriguing.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay, yeah, I'm curious about that. Okay.
right, well, we'll get into that. But
Sure,
so
yeah.
I'm really curious. I'm just going to start out with some simple questions about your deconstruction process, and then I really want to talk about your book as well.
Thank
So
you. Okay.
for those who are watching the beginning of this and haven't made it to the end yet, we're going to discuss Permission Granted as well by Dr.
Oh,
Bird. Wonderful book.
you have tabs too, thank you. Yeah.
I-
I have tabs for using it to teach, but yeah.
Real readers use tabs.
Indeed. Close readers actually digest things, yeah.
If you don't
Okay.
dog ear your books or tab them, I don't think you read it.
I don't I don't have as much respect for you if you don't have a lot of things going on.
That's
I
right.
know. Yeah.
So about your personal experience,
Sure, yeah.
first question, did you grow up in the faith, and what type of a background did you have that might have either primed you or prepared you to be a believer?
Yeah. So I did grow up in a Christian home. My family went to a United Methodist church. So United Methodists are kind of middle of the road in terms of they're kind of social justice oriented in terms of how they think about the gospel, and it's, sure, the gospel is the same stuff you'd hear in an evangelical setting, but it's toned down, and the works and things that you do are focused on helping make the world a better place. So like we would do Appalachian Service Project trips every summers where you go help rebuild homes or build homes or help make people's homes safer for them to live in. And that was a big deal. This is how
Yeah.
you live your faith, right? But so that's kind of what I grew up in. There were certainly more like conservative elements, people within that framework, right? But that was the denomination I was a part of, and it's also I'm going live on this, so I need to be careful here. One of the things about United Methodists that kinda drive me, it's a little frustrating for me, is that the focus is on consensus and not on, which makes it hard to educate and move the needle, right?
Right.
And so respect for trying to keep
Hmm.
everyone is still welcome here sort of, but we're not gonna, when it comes to things like the Bible, the biblical teachings, what is in here, and actually being better educated about them, that is a long
Hmm.
way off for that denomination even still, and it is an issue because, I'm sorry, this is a tangent you probably didn't want, but I'm gonna give it to you
No, it's
anyway,
okay.
because it's relevant to the work I do.
Right.
This denomination is about to they're losing numbers because of the language over ordaining and marrying
Right.
LGBTQ folks. So,
That
excuse
was
me.
still a fight back when I was in seminary. They were
Mm.
still fleshing those out during some of the councils.
Right, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And they are, and, like, that's some of the work I do is specifically geared toward helping people in that kind of a situation to work through the texts, to have a more informed understanding of them so that you can actually talk about, what are we gonna do? How do we wanna handle this conversation? But anyway, so my point here in sharing that is I've come full circle because I've moved back to where I grew up, and
Mhm,
so
mhm.
my parents are still in that church, and I'm watching them, and I'm trying to help this denomination, or I'm trying to help people in the denomination kinda navigate these waters. So, anyway, I grew up in that kind of a framework, and I longed for more energetic excitement engaged, take it, you know, like, get into it kind of stuff. And I think that's what actually primed me to be very like, I was prime material for being a part of Young Life, which is an evangelical outreach to high
Right.
school kids, right?
Yes.
So I was, you know, I was a part of that, like, I was targeted, I was, you know, like, I got swept up in that.
That is the right word. Targeted. That's the right word.
And I, you know, I'd had a like, an evangelical like, I'd had a come to Jesus moment, and when I was, like, 12 or something, and it just scared my mother, she had no idea what was going on, you know, like, there was a choir in town, and I just started bawling, and I walked forward, you know, nothing anyway, so, like, I'd had that moment early on, and then as a teenager, I went to one of the Young Life camps, and, you know, like, it was much more rational, like, "What's going on here? Blah, blah, blah." And then I was also involved as a volunteer for 4 years in college. I helped establish a new, like,
Mhm,
you know, club as a college student volunteer, you know, and then I did training program with Young Life. So I had a good
mhm,
7, it's a biblical number, right? Good 7 years in Young Life. And and during that
mhm.
time, my mother was ordained, and I on her
Oh,
ordination day yeah, on her ordination day, me, the 20-year-old
mhm.
know-it-all, turned to her and said, "I don't know how you could get ordained, mom, because it's against God's will for women to be
Right.
ordained." First Timothy 2, right? Like, oh my god. I said that to her,
Yeah.
and we had a 5-hour drive home, just the 2 of us, and that's how I
It's a very
started.
quiet drive, huh?
He was well, I always say, like,
Mm.
"I'm just glad she didn't open the door and push me out," you know, like No, she actually told me her story, and that was a thing I had never heard, like, her version of everything that had gone down, and I was speechless for the one time in my life. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I can't really say anything back to this." So, anyway, so I don't know if that gives you some of the sense of, like, my family's very different from me. They
Right,
all just scratched their head as I changed my wardrobe in college so that I wouldn't cause my boyfriend to stumble, you know, like, the whole 9 yards,
right.
right?
'Cause it's your
And
responsibility to keep him pure, not
m
his.
exactly. It was my responsibility not to not make my brother stumble my, you know, brother in Christ who I'm making out with, yeah, stumble.
Right.
So yeah, but they're questioning that these people are incestuous? Yes, of course.
Right,
Anyway,
yeah, exactly.
so does that give a little bit of, like, that's, you know,
Yeah,
and then I had a moment when I was on the training program, so the 2 years after college, a woman who had formerly been one of my Young Life leaders wrote a paper on the Martha Mary passage,
right.
right? And she looked at the Greek and this was a master's you know, program paper, and she said, and the, you know, the professor she was working with, like, this passage can uphold two different ways of of interpreting that last phrase, you know, Martha, you are worried about many things, what how it's usually
Mhm.
translated as Mary has chosen what is better, you know, get over yourself. But the Greek also can handle that Mary chose
Right,
is better.
right.
And Justin, for
What a
me,
scandal.
what a scandal! And
You
and
don't get
for
to
me,
choose, get back in the kitchen.
right? Right? And it like, I'm not kidding you, at that moment in time, this woman writing this paper, and she actually referred to me well, she that
Mhm.
moment happened, and then, like, in later in the paper, she referred to me as a Martha who had been giving into social constructions
Mm,
for women, like, she literally named me in the paper, and I'm like but, like, when I read that phrase about coming from the words of Jesus, right? That a woman it's better for a woman
yeah.
to choose what she wants to do. I had an experience that I've never had before, like, it felt like the universe opened up and, like, went back together in a
Yes.
different way. I was like, "Woomba," you know, like, "What just happened?"
Yeah,
So,
sometimes when you hear the scripture in a way you haven't heard it before,
right,
it feels every bit like a spiritual awakening,
it does,
right?
and this was, you know, like, the most important person, you know, Jesus, right? In saying telling empowering me, right, to do
Right,
what I am good at, not what I think I should be doing, you know?
right,
It
right.
was huge. So anyway, and then that led to me eventually going to seminary because I wanted to like, if that's available in
Mhm,
the learning the Greek for
mhm.
myself, what else am I missing, you know?
Right,
So I wanted
right.
to learn the biblical languages, so that's why I went to seminary, and then
That
that led to PhD work because I was like, "There's too much here that people need to know that they're not getting to hear because they don't get to come to seminary." So,
I think that's true for a lot of people in seminary. That was I had committed myself to going to seminary before I graduated high school because I thought to
wow.
myself,
Huh,
if the Bible's important, if it's really that critical, I
Mhm.
need to know what's in the original languages. I don't trust anybody. I'm not gonna
Yes.
read. I got 10 English translations, none of them agree with each other.
Exactly,
So I'm like,
right?
if I'm gonna live my life based on this thing and tell other people to do so, I'm gonna make damn sure I know everything there is to know.
Good for you. I mean, honestly, and yeah, I resonate with that. Like, if this is directing my
Mhm,
life, right?
mhm,
Like, I wanna know what it I don't wanna just trust a bunch of pale males to tell
right.
me what it says.
But, of course, that's, t for a lot of Christians, that's the problem.
Mhm,
You ask too many questions,
mhm.
and you weren't letting the Holy Spirit lead you. You were never a real Christian, of course,
Right,
that's why you
right.
fell away. You were never
But
one of us.
he was never genuine, even though you genuinely were an evangelist for 7 years, it wasn't genuine.
Right.
What helped me, and I imagine you had something similar, Justin, as you went through seminary, but I kinda held on to 2 different ideas
Mhm,
that I came to fortunately, I came to early on because I was started struggling pretty early on, like, when you're starting to engage these new ideas, and at least they were for me, and it was really pushing me, it was pushing all the slippery slope concerns, like, if I
mhm.
agree that this is actually happening, then where's it gonna stop? And so
Yeah,
I had 2 convictions. At the time, right? I believe that God gave me the brain I have, so it has to be okay to use it, and
yeah.
in particular, here in the most important part of my life, as compared to leave your brain at the door and just come in and follow. Excuse me. And the second conviction I had was that if God and the Bible, and I didn't realize it so much at the time, but those were kinda equal, like, people
Mhm.
I kind of thought of the Bible as essentially on the same level as God because of thinking of it as inerrant and all those things, right? So for me, if God and the Bible can't handle my questions, then they don't deserve my devotion.
Right.
And that's what framed for me what people today call deconstruction. I didn't call it that, I didn't have that language at the time, and
Mhm.
I think of it more as simply becoming more informed instead of but it really did follow what people the language people use to talk about deconstruction. I mean, it was like I felt like everything was ripped apart in that first year or so of seminary,
Mhm.
and then it got stirred up and messier for a while, and then I had to kinda put it back together myself a little
Mhm.
bit? So, I mean, I definitely have followed that trajectory. I just didn't have that language at the time, and so I think of it more
Yeah.
as like, "Oh, I'm just becoming more mature in my faith or more mature in my understanding
Mhm.
of these things."
So you didn't wanna just go off and live in sin then? That
Love it. I mean, it cracks me up that people say that. I'm like and it's like the immediate go-to. "You just wanna live in sin." I'm like, "Why do you say that? What is it that that's a whole other can of worms, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is it they mean by sin? And, I don't think that half the
Well,
things they call sin are actually a problem, and.
yeah. I think they
Mhm.
have to though, right? Because if they admit that someone who is intelligent and committed and dedicated to the faith, if they can just change their mind and walk away,
Mhm.
that means that their book is got a problem because their book says that's not supposed to happen. Except if you read Hebrews chapter 6 verse 4, then you have an opposing view on that. But if you read the other passages that says you're never allowed to fall away, it can't happen. You were never one of us. Well,
Yeah,
now you've got a decision to make. You're like, is the Bible true or is
right,
this person telling me the truth? And
right.
9 times out of 10, they'll say, no, this person is
It's
lying
not
to me, and I'll call
guilty.
you a liar to your face.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And go ahead.
I would say that this is, I think, the turning point, though, is this line of reasoning only works when people don't know you. When it's somebody who's your brother, your sister, someone who's known you all your life, those aren't the people that are going to be like, no, you're a liar. You're never a true Christian. Those are the people, your story is actually affecting those people because you're like, I know this person. I know
Mhm.
they're not doing this out of ill will. This is something I need to consider.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right, I
yeah,
have history with this person or whatever, and this is wow, this is amazing to see where this person is after all we've watched them go through. I mean,
right.
truly, my family was just very confused by me for so long, for those 7 years or more. Like, "What is she doing? Why?" And they just kinda put up with me, which is nice. And now I'm maybe on the other end of things that they're like, "Whoa, a little bit too far
Right.
there, Jen."
So when you were in the faith, um, I'm curious. There's always a couple elements about people in the faith that I want to say helps keep them in the faith. Because at any point in time, somebody could theoretically fall away. What were some of the things that led you not only to want to be into the faith, like to remain in it even during your questioning periods, but were there also negative reinforcers, like the idea that you could end up in hell or that there would be negative repercussions in your life somehow if you left or you deconverted too far?
So, w yeah, these are really interesting questions, and I excuse me, and I think I've because you'd asked about you'd given me kind of the the little ahead of time, the question about hell. I I don't remember I don't think I was scarred by that concept the way a lot of people within
Right.
that grew up in evangelical
Mhm.
frameworks, right, have been scarred and traumatized, really.
Yeah.
I think the concept of hell um, definitely was a piece of it, but it was more background for me.
Okay.
I think what happened for me was more about community, and
Mm.
what I mean by that is when I was in college, right, my friendship group were all
Yeah.
other young life leaders, and we were all very, most for the most part on the same page about all these things. And I kinda had to leave them behind when I went off after I graduated, but then I had another whole new set of, like, huge network of people that involved with Young Life, like, thousands of people that I would interact with every year. And all kind of on the same thing, and it was a fun, like, big, huge family kind of a feeling,
Mm.
people were acknowledging me as, "You could go all the way, Jen. You could be president of Young Life, like, if you wanted to be. Like, you've got what it takes. You're great, blah, blah, blah. We love" whatever. And when after that, and I had a dramatic depressive year or so of just,
Mhm.
like, crying in the car every time I got in the car kinda thing. Um, didn't know at the time that was because of I was having these basic faith crises
Right.
moments about what these things I'm teaching people and what I and how that doesn't actually jive with who I am and what I like deep down believe. Took a while for that to all sort out. Um, so I had another huge group of people that I lost, and then I went to the
Right.
Northwest, had a f kinda got a new group of community, again, very similar, very conservative evangelical, very involved with that, super fun. Lost all of them when I went off to seminary, and when I went to
Right.
seminary, I spent 3 years, like, trying to get to becoming a part of another group of people, and that was, like, the tipping point for me is I took feminist womanist theology and with my best friend at the time, and we came out of that class we both went in nervous to take it because I was terrified to read these angry feminists, right? Because I was sure I wasn't gonna agree with anything they had to say, but I
Is
needed to
that
know
the
my enemy.
characterization where
It
you were? Because that's where it was where I was.
Yeah, oh, no, I was terrified, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
angry feminists, for sure, even at
Exactly. Yeah.
Princeton, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
this was like a fringe course, no one took this course. Feminist and womanist, which is, like, Black women theology, right?
Right.
And I just knew I needed to know my enemy kinda thing, and I need to know what they
Yeah.
think, right? So I can combat it better,
You're gonna
so
root them out from the inside.
exactly. I'm gonna
Yeah.
understand them and take it apart. And of course, I get to the end of that semester, I'm like, "Yeah, I think they're right. I think they're onto something." And and I was free to do that because I wasn't at seminary to go be a pastor.
Okay.
My best friend was not so free to embrace feminist theology because she needed to go get a pastorate. She needed to
Right.
pay off student loans when she
She had to
left.
teach. Yeah, she had to
She
go lead the flock.
she did, and you can't push the flock too far.
Right.
So we like, I lost that whole network again, right? And so and it was over theology. So for me, it was, "Jen, are you gonna be true to yourself? Are you gonna have
Mm,
intellectual integrity? Or are
right.
you gonna hold on to this group of people who would be nice because they have this really fun connection and they know each other well and it's fun to be a part of, but like, do you really want that? If what they're talking about and believing is this other thing, and I had a really sharp, pointed thing that happened for me shortly thereafter. Same group of people. We were at a wedding rehearsal dinner, in a wedding for someone in that same group, and it was just really in my face about, no, they're really still sticking to those that theology they went
Yeah.
into seminary believing, and I'm like, I can't believe you're mocking people so anyway,
Right.
so for me, it has always been the issue has been losing people
Okay.
and losing community and deciding that was better than staying in a community where I know people are believing things that I think are ridiculous.
Right. No, I I've seen that a lot, and I think that's a big motivating factor for a lot of people, even
Mhm.
in the middle of the deconstruction process, but even after. I've seen people who literally no longer believe. They won't tell a single soul.
Mhm.
I know that they don't believe. They've said
Mhm.
enough things to me for me to pick up the pieces, but they're still in church every Sunday.
Mhm.
They're saying
Mhm.
grace over dinner because I think the loss of community is such a large factor. It's enough
It
to
is.
keep you in the game.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, and it's a mix such I mean, in a sense, it's a mixed bag. I knew for instance, when I was in so my first 2 years in PhD work, I was at Baylor University, and they had a thing about the faculty at Baylor all had to be a member of a church.
Mhm.
Didn't have to be American Baptist. I mean, but that's the most of the theology, religious studies faculty were American Baptist. But beyond that, the rest of the university still had to have their name on a membership roll somewhere. And so the most progressive congregation in town is where most of them were,
Right.
which means it's a really cool community. Like you've got Buddhists and atheists and all, like hanging out together on a Sunday morning
Yeah.
because they have to for their job. Um, and that was that so to me, that was like this, "Oh." I mean, I know that many of them felt like they were forced to be there, of course, but there was also something for them in it, in the community and the people, and they didn't have to agree, they didn't have to say the creeds, they didn't have to sing the songs, but
Mhm.
they were there, and there was something about and it's certainly not ideal. I don't mean to say that this is the way people should function. I'm just saying that there's such a wide range, I guess,
Mhm.
but ultimately what I hear you asking about, Justin, is just the com the expectations and the compulsion, right? And the if you're gonna what does it mean to believe even? You asked the question about believing, or you made the comment about believing. And I'm like, well, I just believe something different.
Mhm.
I believe in humanity. I don't think of humanity as sinful from birth. Like that's a huge shift for me.
Mhm.
And that's really important. And that's why I refer to myself as a humanist. Right, but, like, I still believe
Mhm.
things, like, who is it why is it that this group of people gets to have the monopoly on what it means to believe, right? Like,
Right.
I just wanna punch back at that or something, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I still believe, I just have very different beliefs, and they're, to me, much more mature and more 21st century-ish.
Right. Which brings up a good question. I think a lot of times when you're doing your deconstruction, especially when you're in higher education, where do you go to ask questions? Were you even encouraged to ask questions, or were you encouraged to just kinda toe the line?
It's almost like I asked you to ask me that, um, because the first semester at PhD work at Baylor, I took a seminar on the was it the Psalms or Amos? I guess it was the Psalms. And even though I was in New Testament, I was still doing some Hebrew Bible stuff.
Sure, sure.
Yeah,
Which
and
we appreciate the Old Testament guys, that's what I studied. We love to see New Testament people cross over in every now and then.
right, yeah, dabble a little bit. Um, so this professor was very kind, and so we had a midterm oral examination. So like to come in and tell, show that we've done the reading, we understood the books we read so far in the semester. And then and I did fine. And then he said, "So, Jen, I need to ask you, are you gonna be happy here? Because you're asking questions we just don't ask."
That is the
And I
most passive aggressive question.
right? I mean, so here's the thing. At least he gave me a chance to, like, know
Right.
what was coming.
Right.
So for the rest of that semester, and then for some reason, I took another class with him because I wanted
Oh,
to study Amos or whatever, but, like, for the
I mean,
rest
it's
of
a
that
good book.
semester, it's the best of the prophets, in
It's a
my
great
opinion.
it's a great book.
If you're gonna read a prophet to understand what prophets were up to, I think he's the safest.
I mean, it's got everything. It's got great rhetorician.
Yes.
It's got some
Oracles,
of the best
imaginations.
insults of the Bible.
Totally.
He c he
That's
calls the women cows.
Totally, right? You should have seen the day in the seminar when we got to that, like, there was only one person in the room, and it wasn't me, who was like, "We need to talk about this."
Actually,
Calling women cows.
on brand, on topic, I don't know if you can see it. I've got a coffee mug that I made. It
Your
says, "Your
wife will
wife will
become
become a harlot in the city," by Amos.
love that. Where did you get that?
I've actually got my whole line of out of context Bible verse mugs.
That's awesome. I'm gonna have to look into that. Okay, um, so here's the thing, Justin, for the rest of that semester, and then anytime I was around him, he would contradict everything I said, he would counter everything I said, or silence me outright. And what happened then, so I ended up, instead of doing 2 years there, I just did 3 semesters, and I was like, I'm done, I can't," and fortunately, I was able to transfer. But they shut down my critical thinking. That
Right.
they would not allow my critical thinking, they would not, and I was warned, you know, but that's, so higher ed, there, it was just the worst thing possible. When I switched to Vanderbilt,
Mhm.
all my questions were encouraged and welcomed, and bring it, and let's have these conversations, critical, interdisciplinary conversations, and I had a great time. And it was, I wouldn't have appreciated it as much if I hadn't started at Baylor.
Right.
Um, Anyway, so it really just depends on your context and how much grounding you have. Do you have enough of a
Mm.
spine to say, "I'm just gonna ask the question anyway," or are you in a space where you're able to do that? But
Right.
yeah, yeah.
I I I had an experience. So Ashland was a little bit different. Ashland never wanted to put people into theological bubbles. They always wanted to give you a breadth of different ideas and let you figure it out. And
It's
I had kind of
refreshing.
the experience where sometimes I would press my professors with questions, and they would just refuse to give me straight answers. I knew the answer to some of the questions, but they wouldn't say it out loud.
Because it would undermine their own faith to
It
acknowledge
kind of, yeah, because it would cause other students to start
stumble.
the pre
Start the process, the unraveling process.
and at the end of the day, like, if you're a seminary professor, you have to have students in your classroom, and if you have to have students in your classroom, you have to have Christians. So you can only undermine the message so much.
I I think that's true. I really do, and
Mm,
I yeah, I think about the faculty at Princeton that I had honestly, the privilege of studying with. Like,
mhm.
they're some of the biggest names in terms of that, like, biblical studies and
Oh,
theology and all
yeah.
that stuff. And I such kind people, such gracious people, most of them, and just lovely, and yet they still conform at the end of the
Right,
day. It's just never too it's always within a realm of appropriateness for the Christian message on some page, right? And not even terribly liberal for them in that context. Anyway, yeah, I agree with you. And it's troubling, and it's complex, and it's what's made it hard for me to have a full-time position in higher
right,
ed, and which is why I'm now just trying to be an independent scholar and do my own thing and make that work, and
right,
so that I can keep teaching and bringing information to people, you know?
right.
Yeah.
What was the experience with your friends and family? I know you lost some community during the process.
Mhm.
W Were there attempts by friends and family to, like, rein this in? Like, can we can we pull her back to the fold?
There were a couple. One was before I went to seminary, I had someone I didn't know very well at all yet invite me over to have dinner with his family, and he really wanted me to not go because he was afraid I was gonna think my way out of my faith. I'm sure you heard that, many times, right?
Yep,
Yep,
yep, mhm,
yep. And I remember thinking, "Yeah, I'm afraid I might also, but I gotta go do it. And I
Y
didn't think through,
yeah,
like, the next steps of that, like, what will happen if I do? I just couldn't go there. I'm like, "I'll get there when I get there." So I had that happen. I also had the first weekend so when I transferred to Vanderbilt, so that was 2003. 2003? Um, that fall, the weekend before classes started, I had a conversation with a current PhD. I think he was a year ahead of me in the PhD program in theology, and then a current at that time MDiv student. We were just hanging out after dinner or whatever, and at one this was the very first time I said it out loud. So I was, what, 31 years old, the first time I said it out loud that I did not believe that Mary was actually a virgin.
r right? Yeah, and we're gonna get to that when we talk about the
Okay,
book
good. Yeah,
because
yeah. But, like, I was that old before I said it out loud, and
yeah,
I was nervous to say it out loud, and at the end of that and I also, commented that I was in the ordination process because Presbyterians will ordain to a teaching position, and I
mhm,
kinda wanted that. I wanted the stamp of the church behind what I was teaching. And at the end of that semester, the guy took me to lunch and said, "I love the church more than my own feet." I don't know what that means. "And I'm gonna ask you to pull yourself out of the ordination process because you don't
oh,
believe in one of the tenets of
no.
the church, right? I
Yeah,
really think you need to pull yourself out of or this is not okay with me." And I
mhm,
remember thinking, "The gall of this guy, like, that makes me wanna stay?" I had some
right.
I had some poignant, like, poetry that I wrote from that encounter. One was called "Heretic," and one
I
anyway. Yeah. So, but that was it. Like, I didn't have a lot of
okay,
people in my family that were really concerned. Like, I think my one of my brothers has read all like the books I've written, and he doesn't like it, but he doesn't. We don't have a good enough relationship for him to
right,
actually have a productive conversation with me about why I shouldn't be thinking this way.
right. That's
Um,
a good point, because a lot of the people when you're in school, when you're in higher education, you're kind of deconstructing things. The fact of the matter is the types of questions you're asking are not the types of things that normal folk in the church are
right?
prepared to discuss.
Exactly. I mean,
It's
that's
not.
why it's happening there at higher ed and not in your congregation, right? Like,
Right.
that's why people tell you to stop asking questions at Sunday school, right?
That's right.
We can't handle that here.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And I was warned, probably like you were before going to seminary. I had a good friend of mine who went to Bible college, but not to seminary. And he says, "Justin, you already went through Bible college." And he goes, "But when you go to seminary," he said, "You're not going to like you're going to come back changed. Everything you think you know now will likely be different." And he said, "When you come back, if you're still in ministry, just remember that the people that you're preaching to in church aren't prepared to hear anything that you're saying. They're just not."
It's true. And I mean, it's this cyclical issue, right? And
Mhm,
honestly, Justin, that is precisely why I wrote the book that you have recently read because I I'm grateful. I got to teach for 6 years at Greensboro College right out of PhD work. And it's a teaching college, which means it's a heavier course load than you would have at a university,
mhm,
and then because the college was trying to stay open and not I was actually carrying extra, so I had a 4 or 5 teaching load for 6 years, which is very high, and half of that was more than half of that was intros. So, I taught 36 intros in 6 years, right, to the 2 primary testaments. I got really good at it, right? And I would have students saying, "I wish I could share this conversation we just had today with my family, with my youth pastor, with
mhm,
my whoever." And I'm like, "Yeah," because I'm approaching it in a way that's not in your face. It's not making fun
mhm,
of you for believing what you believe. I have a kind of part of my teaching philosophy is to invite. It's invitational, inviting people to consider new ideas as compared to making fun of someone for not having considered this, or for not, you know, I didn't budge when someone made fun of me, right? I budged when I had a chance to consider for myself in a safe way. So that's why I wrote this book is there are people in the
mhm,
pews or wherever who would actually like to know this in a safe way, given the chance to process it and figure it all out slowly, right? Because it took me multiple years, right? Multiple years, and I was studying intensively for 9 of those, so it's
right.
like Yeah, so anyway, yeah, I can't remember why I got off onto that tangent, but right, people in the pews,
Well,
regular people are not prepared to have these, they're not ready to be confronted with these new ideas,
no.
and it's like, that's why, like, I mean, I think of this as, something that a pastor could use to teach at their church many of the primary things they learned at seminary that changed things for them, and this way
Right.
I get to be the outside person bringing new ideas, and they get to do the whole pastoring, helping them figure it out,
Right.
but
So
yeah.
with that in mind, and I've asked this to a lot of people, and I get a different answer every time I ask it, but it's an intriguing question to me.
Okay,
Uh, are there people that you have to avoid conversations with on like some of these touchy subjects? Like I know for a fact I can go to my twin brother and we could talk about anything the Bible says no matter what. But
cool.
I cannot go to my aunt and ask particular questions because it turns into it's a hairball. It's not going to turn out well.
It's
Do
terrible.
do you have to kind of pick and choose who you talk to and about what topics?
For sure, for sure, like, I can't I mean, it's a constant navigation, actually, when you put it that way, it's a constant navigation, like, I know I can talk to my dad about certain things that my mom is very uncomfortable with, and I can talk to my mom about certain things that dad just doesn't give a rat's ass about, and,
Right.
and he just calls it, whatever. I'm not gonna throw my dad on the bus. Um, I have 3 older brothers, one of which I'm just deeply fond of, and we've been very good friends, since high school or whatever, and we can talk about anything, and then the other 2, for different reasons, it's I let them dictate
Right. Right.
what we will or won't talk about, and one of them is, much more conservative, has had this conservative swing, and he's, kind of re-embracing all of the Christian doctrines and things, and it's because of the family he moved married into, and that's, his thing, and it's freaking me out, and I don't bring anything up with him, but if he brings something up, then I very carefully do as little engaging on it as possible.
Right. I
Yeah.
get that.
Yeah, and that's family, right? Like,
Mhm.
which ones are we, what are we gonna talk about? It's not those are the last people who are gonna hear something you have to say, right?
Yeah.
Unless they're asking, and that is not usually how it starts.
Yeah. No no prophet is honored in his hometown.
Exactly! No, it's true though, right? Whereas the brother that I'm really close to, he and his wife, like, they'll ask me questions, and we can talk, and it's fine, it's great. And she didn't grow up with any kind of religious training, so she's
Right.
genuinely curious most of the time. I don't know. I mean, I think that's true for maybe it's true for a lot of people, but maybe more heightened because it's what I
Mhm.
do versus
Right.
kinda what I believe,
From a
and
theological perspective, what were some of the harder during your process, what were some of the harder things to say, "Well, if I put this aside, this has really serious ramifications, and I'm reluctant to do so." Were there
Mm,
parts that
mhm,
you're like, I cannot so readily just cast this aside even with the evidence kind of looking me in the face?"
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and the first one that popped in my mind when you asked that, when you posed the question, is the Isaiah 7:14.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
Oh my gosh! That was the final straw for me, I think, really.
Yeah.
And I remember the day when I was at Vanderbilt, I think, before I had someone like, point it out to me. So I was well into PhD work. It wasn't in seminary. And it was a Jew is AJ
Mhm.
Levine pointing it out, and in her New
Mhm.
Testament class, and I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that before. Holy crap. That feels like the hinge point or like the linchpin, right? If you're going to question the virginal birth and that, and I know I don't need to explain it to you, Justin, at all, but
Mhm.
like just kind of teasing it out here a little bit in conversation, right? If you're going to question this particular thing, and that also then unravels all the other pieces about the way Matthew is quoting scripture out of context and using it to, how is it we're understanding
Mhm.
Matthew here?
Right.
Is he saying it's fulfilling, or is he saying it's adding meaning to, and what's the difference there? Am I okay with that? I had another big one. One other of the big ones was the creation stories. That was a
Yeah.
big one for me in
Right.
seminary. Yeah,
Right.
like, wait. So I think but the biggest one was that. And then what's interesting to me, Justin, is that I had long kind of stopped being a part of Christian communities and things, but there were still elements of what's in the Bible that I hadn't considered from a new perspective, so that even when I encountered it long
Mhm,
after stop associating, it was still challenging for me. So things like, yeah, you know what I'm talking about, or you've had, yeah, right? So, like, things about, for instance, the Gospel of John and
mhm.
the disciple Jesus loved. Like, when I read Ted Jennings' book on, the man Jesus loved, homoerotic narratives in the New Testament, like,
Which a lot of people don't know about this book yet. I got turned on
yeah.
to it, pun intended, when I was in Bible college.
Seriously? You heard about it in Bible college?
Yeah, so it was just I was in a random grouping of friends, and so, the Bible college I went to was
See?
fairly not liberal, not conservative,
Mhm.
and we actually had a lot of females in Bible college, and a lot of differing opinions, and I actually knew a couple people, in Bible college who were already out, and it
Okay.
was okay, right? So
Huh.
they're the ones that kind of started bringing this subject up, and I said, "That's interesting. That's
That's
certainly
an
interesting."
understatement. That's an understatement, right? Like, yeah, John's Jesus depicts him as being a part of a lover-beloved relationship.
Very yeah,
I think that's pretty
Greco-Roman.
clear. Yes, I think that is pretty clear if you're willing to
Yeah.
see it, and it took me a while, even though I was no longer identifying as a Christian, to be willing to see it, and to be
So
willing to let that be okay, you know? Even though
so
I
doc
was sorry, go ahead. I mean, but it's a
no,
big deal that it was still deep in me even though I wasn't
it
right?
is.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
a really big deal, but I don't know if the viewers know what we're talking about
Oh,
yet,
what?
so we we need to let them know real quick.
Okay, yes, there's that.
Okay, so for those who aren't aware, the relationship, especially in Greek, is, when you have a beloved, in the ancient practice of pederasty, there's this idea, where, an older male, rather than going to an educational institution, could take you under his wing and train you to be a man as you're going through your rite of passage, I guess you would say, prepubescent period. And often this young boy, was considered the beloved of the elder person doing the discipling, and part of that relationship typically included, um, sexual
Sexual
relations.
intimacy, yeah. Here's the thing about the tweak on that, is that
Mhm.
I don't think it always whatever because of course there's a power dynamic here, and the age differential is certainly a problem, like, it is problematic, but I think that there's so I'm not sure what I'm trying to do here. Am I trying to defend John? Maybe that's what I'm doing right now, I don't know. Um, yeah, so pederasty specifically as a practice is problematic. I don't think that all of
Right.
the relationships were as
No,
abusive in that kind of exploitative way.
no, they weren't.
And so I just for the sake of,
Mhm,
conversation here, depicting Jesus in such a relationship as the lover to a beloved is what I think is happening in the Gospel of John.
mhm.
Um, maybe not as exploitative as the typical pederastic relationship.
Right, yeah, it is also important to recognize too, and a lot of people have wrote about this, the idea, of male on male relationships in the 1st century, like, we think of it like, "Oh, they wouldn't have done that." Are you crazy? Have you
Mhm.
read ancient Greek and Roman literature? It's
Exactly.
super common.
It's
There was
right,
no hangups over it.
right.
In fact, even Nero had a public, he called him his wife, but it was a young male, and he even rode after one of the victorious battles, rode on the chariot with him into town during the victory parade.
Everybody knew what was going on.
Everybody knew.
And he could get away with it or whatever.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I
So
don't think it was taboo, really.
right, and especially if you had power. But so what Ted Jennings's book pointed out for me that I hadn't seen before is this issue of what I grew up thinking, of as um, the 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 beloved disciple instead of the man Jesus loved, right?
Right.
The language I heard was the beloved disciple, which allowed me to identify with the beloved disciple. Jesus loves each of us the way he loves the beloved disciple, and it makes it very spiritual as compared to the lover beloved language, which is all about this particular person having access to Jesus in a way that no one else did, and the kind of the intimacy, the familiarity, the chosen, the very different, you're very special in a very different way than everyone else. And what is really powerful to me is the way the disciple whom Jesus loved is first pointed out at in John 13, which is when, right, they're doing that big long love fest, and
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus is telling him how much he loves all of them, and he's doing this gesture and all the things, and it's in the moment where he's telling him this whole love language about all the stuff, and in that space, one is singled out as the one Jesus loved, right? So it's kind
Right.
of hard to miss or deny, I think. And then, of course, he fleshes out some of the other examples, the really powerful one being at that supper, the disciple Jesus loved is hanging out in his lap, and
Yeah. Resting
English.
on his bosom.
Yes, right? And English translation, like, they do all kinds of gymnastics to, like, ignore that, and,
Yeah.
like, that's not what's happening, and they're next to each
Right.
other at dinner, and, no,
They're
no,
cuddling. Let's be honest.
they're
They're
spooning, yeah.
cuddling at
Mhm.
dinner.
They are, they are. I mean, it
Yeah.
just the language is very clear that he's hanging out in his lap,
Hmm.
and I was like, "What?" I'm trying to process this, and, what does that mean for my understanding of the Gospel of John and what he's doing and all that stuff, and then, of course, also at the crucifixion scene and yada yada. Like when he turns to this disciple and he says, "Here's your mother, mother, here's your son." Like what's going on there, and he explains it very nicely in the book, and it's so. Um, I love that, and it is
Hmm.
not something that every New Testament scholar is aware of. Even New Testament scholars who study the Gospel of John, right?
Right.
Not something that they all know. And I'm not trying to be dismissive or anything like that about that, but it's powerful to me that I spoke to the most prominent Johannine scholar a few weeks ago, and she did not want to go there, wasn't familiar with it, didn't want, right? I mean,
Hmm.
and a big time biblical scholar had not considered this.
Right.
I think that's important to note in terms of the way this all plays out in the field, right?
Right.
She had nothing to lose for reading that and seeing that. Absolutely, she's a Jewish woman. Like, she had nothing to lose, right? And yet
Hmm.
that's not even a part of her radar on her radar. So,
Right. Well, I feel like a lot of the scholars who talk about this topic get pushed into a subcategory and then ignored.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
only a couple of them really break out, like Dale Martin
Mhm.
was able to sort of break the mold a little bit, but even Dale Martin, a lot of scholars would be like, "Well, he's a minority opinion, right?" But
And he's
how
not
do you
even as progressive as some that
I
I think
know.
are even more important. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Oh, man. Anyways,
you're
so
right. You're right.
that's a side quest that we could probably spend a lot of time
I know,
on,
I'm
but
sorry. How do we get into that now?
so I
You asked about passages that were really hard for me.
that's a hard one,
That's
isn't it?
It was a hard one. And
Yeah.
then there are others too, and it's not about my faith anymore. It's about, like, this collection of writings that I'm trying to help other people understand better. It's like it becomes harder and harder and harder and harder. I'm like, "Oh my god. Look at all this enslavement language that we're ignoring, and look at all the
Right.
ways Jesus is endorsing enslavement or using enslaved situations to talk about the kingdom of God." And like, it just gets harder and harder to be like, I don't, you guys, this stuff is bad.
I agree, and it was a little bit easier for me to come to that conclusion because I spent all my time studying the Old Testament,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
in the New Testament, they use these, like, slave metaphors and things like that, but in the Old Testament, like, "No, this is how you can own slaves, and this is you can buy them, children even." I'm like, "Oh, really? You can just go off and buy a slave? Okay, cool. Like,
Yeah,
good to know."
just not your Hebrew neighbor, but someone else
That's right.
from, yeah.
Well, if they're women, you can enslave them for lives because you have full control over their sexual
Yes.
autonomy,
Ye
and once you've defiled her, she's yours.
yes.
You know,
Yeah.
because surely you can't just allow her to go back out in public and defile others by.
She has been defiled. I have a clip about that. Like, have you ever thought about what it is we're saying is defiling the woman? It's the man's penis that
I know
defiles her.
that's in your book, and we're going to talk
Yes.
about that coming
Okay,
up. I got one more question, and
okay,
maybe two more questions that I want to talk about the book because
okay.
there's so much good stuff in the book. Okay,
Thank you.
so in your deconstruction process, I'm always curious because everyone has a different background. Did science play a role at all in your process of deconstruction?
Not not in a big, strong way.
Okay,
No. But I think it was more like, like when someone pointed out there are 2 flood stories and you start talking about the flood and, like, reassessing what, what I'd thought about and believed was actually had literally happened, and then how is that possible? And then you start pulling back and like, wait, how does the thing flood and how do you have a parting of waters? Like, so I remember a time or 2, like, my oldest brother would be like, "Yeah, this doesn't happen, Jen, like, you don't have a parting of waters like that, like, is this a
the math
reciting?"
isn't mathin'.
Yeah, exactly, and the science isn't science, and like, is that like a do we have a tide situation going on here, I'm like, "No, oh gosh, that's a good question, how does that work?" And so I think that, that did in small ways, but not in, like, evolution versus creation kinda way.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I think it really kind of depends on your background. I
exactly.
was forced into it as a because I went to school for engineering first,
Okay, I did too. I
and
started as an engineer.
I thought you had a background in math.
Yes, and I switched to math, but yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult to be among engineers and not get asked scientific questions about the
Totally,
nonsense in Genesis.
totally, yes. Right, I have 2 engineering brothers. Yeah, mhm, and
It's a tough one.
it is, and it's fair, it's good, right? It's a good thing, I think. I have to also say, I started like, I had a moment when I was 8 or 9 where I must have heard in church a reference to, like Genesis 1 or 2 and this whole creating thing, everything out of nothing and whatever, even though that's not really what it says. Anyway,
It's
and I
not in
remember
there.
is that in it? Right. Shaping what exists. But I remember having like that early questioning of like, okay, if God created everything into what where did the space come from to create it into, and then who created God? Like, where did God come? Like, I remember as a child having those
Mhm.
philosophical, theological debates or confusions and, like, challenges, like, "This isn't working, this isn't panning out."
Right.
Of course, then it was set aside for 20 years, and then it it
That
came back.
that gets called, there was a Mormon, I believe, who gave me this term. He says those are shelf items. Those are
Shelf
items
items.
you put
Yeah.
on your shelf to address later,
Yeah.
and then sometime you have to read it, you have to address it eventually,
You do.
but you ain't gotta
Yeah.
do it right now.
Yes, and the big
Yeah.
ones for me in seminary were women in leadership, right? My mother being ordained, and then homosexuality, and I'd interacted with lots of homosexual, men, gay men, and I didn't know that I knew a whole bunch of lesbians in high school, but I did, like right, and I
Mhm.
had to have very safe conversation, but yeah, those were the 2 biggies for me in seminary that
Right.
I had put on the shelf for a long time and had to start addressing, and then this other yeah, came back. Anyway, sorry, random. I'm just kinda all over the place. I hope you're okay with
Okay.
this, Justin. Yeah.
No, I could do this for a long time if it I'm trying to keep
I
it
know.
to an hour for the interview and then, maybe an hour for the book or so, but I would love to have another, follow-up discussions with you on some specific topics because there's so much that we could talk about, and I
There.
think have a great time doing.
Yeah, I think so too.
One of the things that, I want to and the reason why I have this question is I wanna kind of make a clear point to people listening,
Yeah,
especially for the Christians that are listening.
yeah.
There's this idea that, like, people that are deconstructing and maybe have an alternative view or have moved into agnosticism, or like some like me. So I moved from Christianity to agnosticism into atheism. Not everyone does that, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Some people stay in a mix of Christianity and agnosticism. Some people stay somewhere on the other end. But there's like this general view that like people who now have moved from Christianity out of Christianity proper, like we're like miserable beings that hate life, and we
Mm,
just want to degrade Christianity and talk bad about it because we're like mean and bitter and we've lost all hope.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
that's obviously not true, but
mhm.
what are the things that give you hope and excitement? Like, what are the when you wake up in the morning, what do you you know, what are some of the biggest motivators? Because I know you love your work, and I can see it every time I hear you speak on it. Like, I can know this is
Mm.
a woman who loves what she's doing. It's not a woman who's bitter and upset.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I think what motivates me is the combination of I know how freeing it was for me to be better informed on these things. I want that for other people who are interested in it. I'm not interested in pushing it on someone. There are plenty of people I wish would read my work or watch my videos, but that's because I would that's because I think that there's a different way of seeing the world, but that's what's worked for me, and it's not my business to force it on anyone else. You have to
Right.
understand, this is a long way for a former evangelist to come, okay?
Both of us, we
Right?
at both points in our lives, we were trying to convince people to
Totally.
come to this
Yes.
faith.
Yes, exactly, and it was my fault, right? So it's a big
Mhm.
deal to say, "No, I'm not interested in forcing on people anymore," but so that motivates me that there are people who are telling me they like my work and it helps them, and then that motivates me to keep doing it because I think there might be other people who might discover it and find some
Right.
freedom. There are others out there who want it, and that's I think, gosh, it is such a privilege to have had 9 years of schooling, right? After undergrad, right?
Yeah, it
Like,
really
that's a
is.
huge privilege. I need to do something with that. It's kind of a mixture of all these pieces, like, when I do present a do an kind of well thought through structured presentation, people really appreciate it, and I'm like, "Right, that's because you're using the things you've been given, and you need to keep doing that." So, yeah, it's a
That's right.
mixture of motivations, but it's all about what was helpful for me, which was being better informed
Mhm.
and how that freed me up to be, a better version of myself. Actually, I
Right.
think a more loving version of myself and less judgmental, all kinds of things, so I
Yeah,
hope
that's
that
for su
answers your question.
no, that's a great answer, and I think the last thing you said is so true. Most of the people I know, myself included, who have kinda deconstructed it and left Christianity proper, um, I I regret some of the people that I kind of, judged when I was a Christian, especially people of particular minority groups who you don't necessarily dislike, but because the faith tells you that somehow something's wrong with them and they need to be fixed,
Mm,
you behave in a way, that
yep.
you always regret, and I said it to somebody once 'cause, "What's the one thing you regret about being a Christian?" I said, "I don't know if I really regret being a Christian because I had a great experience. I have no bad memories of being a Christian. Like, I had
Mm,
nothing but good experiences."
mm,
But I said, "I regret some of the ways that I took my friends who are in the LGBT community, and I said, 'Well, this is the way you are, but this is kind of the way God wants you to be.'"
mm.
And even if I thought I was doing it in a loving way,
Yep.
it keeps me awake at night sometimes thinking about
Oh,
what kinda damage I did to them because, like, these are human beings, and you're telling
exactly.
them that there's something wrong with you,
Mhm.
and you
And
need
you
to go get fixed.
you were close enough to them that you meant well, but that was why you were saying it. So it's like a close relationship, not just some random person on the street.
Right, yeah.
That kinda adds to the concern for you, I guess, I'm
Yeah,
assuming?
'cause yes, you cannot deliver truth by itself. You have to deliver truth in love, as they say, right?
Oh my gosh. Yes, I am loving the sinner, not and hating the sin right now, because that's really a thing you can do.
well, you're showing them love by
Right,
demonstrating
by
the error
telling
of their
them. Yes,
ways.
exactly. I do
Right,
not want them to
exactly.
burn in hell.
Definitely not.
I really want you to be in heaven with me. Yeah, mhm.
Exactly.
No, I'm
Yeah.
sad though that there are some things that still and I'm just sad for you on that. I think I there was a point where like, I thought about some of the things I said to some teenage kids, like, when I was a young life leader that I cringe at, but then I'm also like, "Yep, that's life," and I'm trying to let go
Mm,
of that is who I was at the time, and I meant well, and
mhm,
I use that to inform what I do now instead of,
right.
um yeah, anyway, I'm sad that that's a thing, and I get it, that that's a thing that, like, actually
Mhm.
probably wakes you up every now and then, like, "Yep, I did this thing to people I cared about."
And it's one of the reasons why on my channel, I talk about the topic a lot
Mm,
because I
mhm.
know that there are other people out there who mean well
Yeah.
that are harming people in their well-meaning,
Right, right. Yeah,
yeah,
and I know this isn't why you had me on, but you know that the more I just had a book released this past fall, Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? Because of that whole conversation and trying to help people have better informed
right.
conversations. But anyway, okay, yeah, just had to throw that out there.
Well, I would love to actually, I have to get a copy of that book, and we'll have a deep dive on
Yeah,
some of those topics
or you could
because
do that. Yeah,
it's a great topic.
it is.
Let's talk real quick, not real quick, as much as we need to about
Sure.
permission granted.
Thank you. Yeah.
So
As much as we can in the next whatever.
so I when I got to the first chapter,
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
interpreting, like the Adam and Eve narrative and, what are some of the nuggets that are in there, it kinda took me back to a class that I had, with Eugene Carpenter on Genesis,
Nice.
and he tended to take, like, a mythological approach to Genesis,
Mm,
and I was always curious, so, like, how many people so many people don't take a mythological approach to Genesis because they've never read any other ancient Near Eastern mythologies.
right, that's part of
But
it.
it looks to me, especially when you get to Genesis chapter 3, that, like, oh, this is an teleological, narrative designed to explain, a mythological explanation for why things are the way that they are.
Mhm.
Like, so if we just look at, like, even the first 11 chapters, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
as mythology, like,
Yeah.
what actually changes? How do we start, like, what does that do for our theology?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to clarify for people, the first chapter is titled What the Bible Is and Is Not. And so that is exactly what I'm trying to do is, okay, this is how people tend to be taught it as a child and essentially are never given an adult version of how to think
Right,
about what the Bible is and is not. And that's, again, as you pointed out earlier, I understand why that happens. I'm not here to judge why that happens. I'm just trying to point out that it does happen and I get it. And this is another way of looking at it, right? Yeah, and the first 11 chapters are sometimes referred to as primeval history, which is actually makes this more
I know.
like confusing instead of primeval mythology or something, right? Even within the scholarship, they're still holding on to a form of a Christian influenced framework, right? In that label.
Right,
But yeah, so what changes? Well, what changed for me was the first wave of a bazillion, right? Of shifting from thinking about the Bible as God speaking to me and
mhm,
everything that I needed to know to this is a story that people wrote. And so what can I see they were trying to deal with? And that's a thing that takes a lot of time to get to. And I teach an intro to the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament 4 times a year. And it's a thing like fully online, by the way, so it makes it pretty challenging. But like I ask students, I frame it and the students in the class that get it are the ones who did not grow up in a church.
mm,
And the
right,
ones who grew up in a church have a very hard time, and I get that, right? Going from, "This is God, this is explaining why sin happens, this is explaining why blah, blah, blah," and I'm like, "No, no, 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 take it a step back. What does it change when you look at Genesis chapter 3? What is that story getting at, right? Explaining why where the heck do these snakes come from without legs, and how do they move? Like, what the
Right, yeah.
hell? Why, and there are a lot of interesting scholarship out there about the whole like agrarian versus nomadic and all the different. And I don't care about like I get that. I know that's a part of this, but I don't have the bandwidth to care about all those details. But it's talking about, you look at the curses, and it is talking about, gosh, why do women in particular struggle around the issue of having children? There's an article that I read in researching for marriage in the Bible that shifted for me. Instead of seeing it about why do women have pain in childbirth, it's about why do women have pangs around childbirth. So the
Mhm,
social construction, of course, about the need to be a mother producing lots of children, and the struggle when you're not able to, as well as the
mhm,
struggle in perhaps at times, the process of it. But it's more than just child pain in childbirth. That's going to take forever to shift that for people. But anyway, yeah, why does this happen? Why is it that we have this idea earlier in chapter 2 of Genesis that the male and females are actually equals, which is what the Hebrew supports, not the way the
mhm.
English translation does it, but the storytellers had this sense that this male and female were equals. And now, but at the end of chapter 3, we're telling the women to be, that man's going to rule over women. Like, how did we?
Yeah.
We have a sense that we should be, but we're not. How did that happen? Um, the Tower of Babel is a fun one to talk about because which is in chapter 11. And that, a lot of people are familiar with it. It's so short. It's so much shorter than I remember it being as a child, but what happens there? Go ahead. You want to say something?
I was saying, no, I agree. I went through it with a buddy of mine recently, and
Yeah.
he said the same thing. I kinda thought there was more to this narrative. I'm like, "No, it's you got 2 paragraphs
Very
maybe."
Yes, exactly, like, 10 verses tops,
That's it.
and yeah, and to a I can tell a person's background when I read how they read the Tower of Babel story, because every single Christian will say that the people building the tower were arrogant and wanted to they were right? They were
Mhm.
trying to be like God, and I'm like, "That's not in the story! Go read it again, it's not in there." And
Not
by
in
the
there.
way, who doesn't like a view from up on high? Like, why are we bashing these people? And also, these are people living in a part of the world that did not have their own handle on things. They were constantly being overtaken by people around them, and
Mhm,
you know what? You can't blame them for wanting to establish themselves, to establish a name for themselves so that they would be respected, damn it. Like,
mhm,
and all the Christian, like, because we had that sin back in chapter 3 and 4 and all that, so now it's all about sinfulness of humans, and so everybody
mm,
so many people are taught to read this as negative. Humans are bad, sinful, something, something, problem, problem, problem. And like, oh no, actually, take a step back. This is actually an interesting story about why your neighbors speak different languages than you do and have different cultures than you do. And there's
right.
no negativity here on humans. In fact, God is the one being kind of petty. And that's a shocker,
Yeah.
right? God is like afraid of what humans can accomplish if they work together. So let's fuck with that. Like,
Well,
yeah,
I
sorry.
think that's, a more honest view of it because I wrote an article on this a while ago. I forget how long ago now, but, as far as I can tell from reading the story, the tower, it's not a problem for the people. The tower is a problem for God.
It is,
Like, it's a
truly.
threat to
It's a threat.
God.
It is. They
Um,
can accomplish anything. Yeah.
right.
So I'm
So
gonna mess with them so they can't.
that's right, and that's
Work
the
together.
explanation for the tongues, for
That's right.
the many
That's right.
tongues, right?
That's right. And and it's how many people do I actually get do I actually have who actually get to the point of being able to see that God is being petty? God is being depicted as being petty. That's a huge thing, right? Because so many people
Mhm.
are thinking this is about who God actually is. This is the Bible. God is like God in the Bible and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think John Walton, he says it a number of times in some of his commentaries, in Genesis. There seems to be a huge concern with mortals and gods mixing,
Hmm.
especially after the fall, and to me, that seems to be the primary concern of the tower narrative. On the topic of looking at like mythology within Genesis, I'm
Oh,
curious to know what your opinion is.
mhm.
Do
I c
you
can I
Uh-huh, go
just
ahead.
interrupt you
Yeah.
for just one quick
Mhm.
second? And then I wanna get back to your question. I'll make this short. You had asked originally what changes if we look at
Right.
especially 1 through 11 as a myth versus like, what things actually happen, and one of the big things was you referred to the fall in chapter 3, and that's one of the big ones for me is it's not a fall, it's a step up for humankind, I think, and I learned that from a rabbi, actually, that this is one of the things about that differentiates humans from other animals is our consciousness or our conscience, and that is at times tricky, right?
Mhm.
It's problematic for us at times. It makes us wake up in the middle of the night, but it also is a thing that differentiates us in a good way. And that to me, like reframing Genesis chapter 3 as not about a fall, but as a step up and as these other things is really freeing for me. So, anyway, that's just a little nugget. Throw out
I
there.
mean,
Back
that's a
to you.
really good point because what is said at the end of Genesis chapter 3 says man has become like one of us, which if that's not an upgrade, what is it? Right?
Exactly.
How
Yeah,
is that not an upgrade?
exactly.
So the being removed from the garden has nothing to do necessarily with being cursed as far as I can tell, although the ground is cursed and, things like
Yeah,
that, but
right.
seems to me like because humans have been upgraded,
Yeah.
there needs to be, some additional measures taken.
Exactly, exactly. I fully agree with that. Yep.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt your
No,
line of
it's great.
questioning, but it's yeah.
I think the next question kind of plays into it a little bit.
Mhm.
The Apostle Paul. I've always been curious because Jesus doesn't have a lot to say about Genesis. Paul says a few things.
That was a great that was just very nicely delivered.
As
Yes, he
as
does.
far as I can tell,
Mhm.
Paul tends to use the book of Genesis to his own theological goals,
Correct. I
as
agree.
opposed to reading it for what it actually says.
Yeah. Right.
Am I crazy for thinking that? Because I feel like Paul is taking the Old Testament as stone cold literal, and then just picking the parts that he wants to prove points that he likes.
Yep, and reads into it. So
Yeah,
he does what you I think he does what you just said, and he reads, multiple things into it versus what it's actually saying. So, like, reading it as historical or literal, and then also these other things. It's powerful because most people have never done that, looked at what Paul says and then looked at Genesis 3. And I've tried many different ways to try to help people see that in particular because it's so powerful for most Christians, right? What Paul says is God I mean, defined the gospel for people. So,
right.
you're not crazy. You are paying attention.
And so Paul addresses the topic of marriage a lot, which you would
Does
think he's got First Corinthians chapter 7.
Oh, he talks about sex.
Right, well, sex, there we go, yeah, sorry, let's be very clear, he's talking about sex, you're right.
And that's actually part of the problem for people today, right?
Right,
The only time the relationship we call marriage is talked about by Paul or Jesus is in light of sex.
right.
Full stop.
So
Yep.
so that's actually the question I wanna get
Okay.
at because
Okay. Sorry, I mean
so your second chapter was sex, who, what, and why,
Mhm.
and, okay, so when people say marriage or biblical marriage,
Mhm.
what are they actually referring to? I mean, what is the Bible actually referring to? Because if you take the idea of the modern institution of marriage and you go to the Bible looking for that, you're
Yeah.
not gonna find it,
No,
right?
you
What
are
what
not.
do you find?
No, you are not. Yep, that's right. Actually, it's chapter 4, not that it matters, but chapter 4 is who, what, sex, who, what, and why, and that is
Oh, yes.
essentially yeah, no, it's fine, but it's, I just had to say it just but, that's what chapter 4 and then pulling that apart and, like, going much deeper is what marriage in the Bible, what do the texts say is, actually. So when people refer to biblical marriage, they are referring to a few basic ideas that it will be procreative, that it will only be between a man and a woman. There's no divorce involved and it's sacred. And that comes from four different a total of 7 verses in the Bible, right? So Genesis 1:28 is about procreating. Genesis 2:24, only a man and a woman, and perhaps no sex before marriage,
Mhm.
which is problematic because that isn't what the texts are saying, because there is no language for marriage, there is no language for husband and wife, and that's a thing that the translation committee members have led us to
Mhm.
believe, right? I don't wanna get into the details right now unless you want me to, but, John Matthew 19:4-6 is the one that the people turn to say no divorce, and in the book, I think it's important to talk about why that's a problem, and it's
Mhm.
not what people think, and then Ephesians 5:31 and 32, that crazy thing about this is a
Mhm.
mystery, and I'm comparing it to Christ and the church. So that's the foundation for sacramental language for the church is that verse, 32. So that's what people mean, and when they say, "I want a biblical marriage," that's usually what they mean is I'm gonna be
Mhm.
faithful to my spouse, we're not gonna have sex for marriage, we just wanna whatever, whatever. But that's,
Mhm.
those 4 passages are actually saying much more than that and something different than that. And
Mhm.
then what does the Bible actually say about marriage is a huge, vast, huge range of women are property to the men. Men can have more than one woman. Men can have more than one woman that belongs to him, and they can have enslaved peoples in their house that they can also have access to for sex.
Yes.
And this is not problematic at all. In fact, it's essential to the creation of the tribes of Israel. The issue of adultery in the Bible is about women's bodies are territory, and one man,
Yeah.
regardless of his in our eyes, marital status, one man having sex with someone else's territory. That's adultery. And it does change into the Newer Testament where it seems that it's kind of either way. But the point is, even in the Newer Testament, adultery is a problem because it's about a woman's body. It's not about
Mm.
it's not about uh, breaching a contract. It's not about I'm cheating on you. It's about a woman's body as territory.
Right.
Very different than well, actually not quite so different than people tend to think about it today because people are still influenced by this way of thinking unconsciously. But yeah, if you talk about, "I wanna have a marriage that is, we're equals, we enter into this willingly, as 2 equals based on love," yeah, that's not found anywhere in the Bible. There is not an example of a
Mm.
relationship that is based on love by 2 equals, both choosing to enter into it.
Right.
It's just not in there. And
Women.
what I was just gonna say, and what's
Mhm.
one of the things that's interesting to me is you kind of alluded to this, but indirectly, that in the ancient world, the relationships that sound most similar to the relationships I hear people wanting for their marriage, this mutuality, this soulmate language, all that stuff, that was what you had in friendships,
Mhm.
soulmate language, and it was, all these things, the intimacy, equals, and you'd share everything, you'd be committed to each other for to the end of your life.
Mhm.
Excuse me, and they were almost always same-sex relationships,
Yeah, like David and Jonathan, of
like
course. Mhm.
David and Jonathan.
Mhm.
And I do think that David and Jonathan is a difficult dynamic because I think Jonathan was into David and it wasn't reciprocated, and David being
Yes.
the exploitative man that he was, just worked with it. But
Mhm.
that's my read. But
I agree.
but still, the only soulmate language we have in the entire Christian Bible is David and Jonathan. Jonathan's
Mhm.
feelings for David. Um There is a reference, by the way, if in case someone is gonna bring it up, there's a reference in Song of Songs, but it's "He whom my soul loves," which is not the same thing as being bound to someone's soul.
Right.
It's as close as we get elsewhere. Anyway, so yeah, marriage in the Bible is very much focused on a woman is property at that time and context. This is about inheritance issues. We need to make sure we know who the in their mind, we need to make sure we know who the father is so that it's a legitimate heir, all that kind of stuff. And perpetuating your family line and running like surviving. Um, Marriage is therefore it makes sense that these texts would focus on and only talk about a male female couple and that they would be concerned about procreation. I'm not the first to say it. In fact, there was kind of a big wig in evangelical Jerry Falwell or somebody said it back in
Mhm.
the '70s that, "You know what, folks? We've got that whole multiply and fill the earth thing down
Mhm.
pat. Let's maybe pare it back a bit." Like, that's contextual for people
Mhm.
who needed to grow and create a name for themselves and establish themselves as a nation, right? That's very different context, right? But that's what marriage was about, and it's the language even in the Newer Testament, the language around marriage or divorce is only talking about this issue, right? When Jesus is attributed with saying those words in Matthew 19, he reinforces that divorce is a problem, not because it's gonna pull families apart, right? Not because it might leave the woman at a disadvantage, which is very true, and people saying he's a feminist because he's trying to protect women here. I'm like, he may have been, but he is also reiterating that women's bodies are territory to be conquered. And
Right.
that is why it's a problem to divorce is you're gonna go have sex with someone else, and that's like, it's just so deeply embedded in these frameworks of talking about relationships that it's actually hard to get Christians in particular to see it, much less to see it as problematic. I mean, I have a hard time getting
Right.
people to see that it's problematic to talk about this way, to talk about sex as only for marriage, that is actually problematic, right? That is
It
hard to get people to see.
it's just not in the text, and even, you alluded to the passage on divorce. Well, if you look at what Jesus is kind of referring to in the Old Testament, divorce is really only mentioned, like, Deuteronomy chapter 24,
Exactly.
and the primary concern is not why you get divorced, the primary concern is that, well, if the woman gets divorced and she becomes defiled by another man, it's
Yes,
improper for her to go back to her previous husband and
exactly.
defile that bed, right?
Yes, yes.
So, divorce was about the woman being defiled, had nothing to do with, like, "Oh, well, this
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 sacred
couple
trust.
can no longer they have irreconcilable differences."
Right, right.
Right? Not at
And
all.
right, and why it's not okay, you've made this vow before God, like, really?
Well, and remember what it says, and this is really interesting, and not enough people bring it up, but, like, in Deuteronomy about divorce, it says that the man gets to divorce the woman and send her out with a
That's
writ, right?
that's right.
There's no provision whatsoever in any of the Bible about a woman being able to divorce her
That's right.
husband,
That's right.
because property can't divorce their
Right,
husbands.
exactly, it's
They
very
can't do
clear.
it.
These are texts written by men for men, right.
Yeah. In fact, and I asked this question before, and you already know the answer. It's a rhetorical question, but can you think of a single passage in the Bible that is specifically talking to women other than to correct them?
Wow, what an interesting question. You say it's rhetorical, but it's not entirely rhetorical. I mean
Not
I mean,
entirely, no.
it makes me wanna do a quick little, like,
Right,
because well, right.
because there
Directed
are
to women. Gosh, no,
directed
right?
to women,
It
like,
isn't to correct them. Yeah, there's nothing
this
that
is
I
to women,
right,
right?
right, we're gonna
And
talk to yeah.
because there's
Okay,
passages
you're
about women,
right, there are. There's in Romans
right?
16, we give some props, some serious props to some women. There's a
Right.
passage in about Deborah as the leader, and Yael is taking matters into her own hands. Those are
Mhm.
narratives. Yeah, so commentary to women that isn't direct no. No, there isn't.
Right. Every biblical text is designed to be filtered through the man
Right.
and then delivered through the man. Like, the
Right,
Bible just
and
does yeah.
yeah, and or when well, I mean, that's a good point too, right? Even the directives to the women are still oh god, yep, still through this. The man is the main one here.
It's a
It's
tough
just
one.
it's a lovely element of the Bible, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've I've got a I've got a Monday night podcast that I do with a friend of mine who's still a Christian, and he said to me, "Justin, I don't know how women can be Christians. I don't understand it, because if I was a woman, I would not accept this book. I would throw it right out the window."
I mean, he's not wrong, right?
He's deconstructing.
Apparently. And
Wh
good for him and slowly and whatever, right? You
Right,
know what
which Mhm.
no, I had a conversation just a couple weeks ago with someone, and he told me that one of his friends, as he was in his marriage where they were deconstructing, and he realized that their dynamic was biblical, right? He was the dominant one in their marriage, and he's like, "We're not gonna do that anymore. We're gonna be equals here, and we're gonna work on that. Like, we're gonna address this, And I'm like, "Are you doing seminars?" 'Cause
Yeah.
'cause
Do
right?
it.
People need help with that,
Mhm.
figuring that. I'm like, "God, that is awesome that they're doing that." Anyway, yeah, yeah.
And one of the topics that's in the book, and I've heard you talk about it as well, online, is on the topic of women being property.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
is there a single instance in the Bible where, a union between a man and a woman is described as a relationship as opposed to a man and his property? Because as far as I can tell, I can't think of a single one.
Yeah, it's no I mean, it's interesting. People will say that Isaac and Rebecca is this kind
Oh,
of an
okay.
example. I don't agree with that, but I know why they're saying that, right?
Right.
She seems game for the whole proposition. She doesn't have an option. So, when the enslaved person Abraham sends someone to go find a woman for Isaac, and he's got all these goods, to purchase her with,
Mhm.
she seems excited about this prospect, and, on a certain level, yeah, she's getting away from home, and she gets to,
Yeah.
but this is, like, her one option. This is her one chance, right? "Here's your one chance, fancy, don't let me down." Right?
And
Like,
then
just
money.
yes, right?
Eleazar put bangles on her wrist, put a nose ring in her nose.
Exactly. And gave her family all kinds of great stuff, right? Linens and
Right.
gold, and so she's game for the situation. That doesn't mean that so there's that. And then when Isaac sees her, he's excited, and he immediately takes her into his mother's tent and has sex with her. Like, you
Right.
tell me, how's that playing out if you are Rebecca? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So
Well, there's no ceremony, was there? And so th
there's no foreplay, there's no
right. It
"Wow, she's beautiful. Come on. Let's go." I don't know. So that's the closest you come, in my opinion,
right.
to something like that, and I don't think that that's I don't even think that that's what you're asking about, right? And
Right.
every other relationship, Jacob loved Leah. Rachel, well, apparently she's beautiful. Like, yeah, well, there's that,
Mhm.
and then
Right.
I'm not late, throwing people under the bus for finding people beautiful, but that's so shallow. And
So,
then God,
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's not my question list, but, like, am I the only one to notice every time, like, a good woman, a loved woman in the Bible appears, she's always described as beautiful? How come they're never described as intelligent or,
exactly.
like, is
No.
that their worth?
Exactly, Justin. I mean, I actually had to have a student had to point that out to me about the book Song of Songs, that I like that it's in there, because they're talking about these are couples who are clearly not married, in our terms, and they have had some intimacy, maybe not all of them, but they've definitely had some intimacy. Um, you know, one of them is describing fellatio, like, come on, like, this is they're intimate, but all of the language when they talk about their lover, right, is about their looks. The
Yeah,
whole thing, it's about what they look like,
it's
and
true.
again, I am not slamming finding people attractive. I think that's lovely when you know what I mean? But there's like you exactly like you said, Justin, there's nothing about, "Man, baby, your mind drives me crazy." Like, that
Mhm.
actually is a thing for some people, is turned on
Right.
by intelligence and turned
Mhm.
on by, like, being a caring person. None of that.
It's not in the text, and even
Nope.
in, if you believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, which I don't know if anyone does, but
Yeah.
anyways, but even in Ecclesiastes, when he comes to like his list of conclusions, what does he say? One of the things, well, since your life is short, enjoy the wife of your youth. Like what? What? Why? Why wouldn't you enjoy the wife that you have now, the one that you just spent the last 30 or 40 years with? That
Right.
right? What?
Unless that's what they're getting at, is like you've been
Right.
with this woman for your whole life, like, enjoy it, but the language itself is
It
questionable, for
It's
sure.
sexual in nature
It
if you read it.
is.
It 100% is.
Totally, and we're talking about oh god,
It
I'm
refers
not
to her bosoms in
yeah.
the text. I was like,
Mhm. It's
you
not
know,
I know, it's just problematic even in the
it
best parts.
there's the treatment of women is incredibly problematic
Yeah,
and,
uh,
like,
yeah.
this is a really fun side quest, but, like, even Abishag, remember, she was found to lay with David in his old age to keep him warm in bed, and says that they searched the whole kingdom for a beautiful woman. What why are you searching the whole kingdom for a beautiful woman to lie with David in bed to keep him warm as this if his other wives, which he had many of,
Multiple.
are they all bone cold? What's the situation here?
Exactly,
How are they not able
exactly,
could they not at
exactly.
least dogpile him and do like,
Many of them,
you know
right?
what I mean? I've seen honeybees in a nest keeping the things warm, you
Slush
know?
pile, right? Like, just
I don't get it, right?
no, it's a great observation. It's just spot on observation about the issue and the yeah,
Right. And,
yeah.
I told you before, I think I've got 4 sisters, and so,
Okay,
like, when
okay.
I read the Old Testament treatment of women, I'm thinking, "If somebody did that to my sister, we'd be having a come to Jesus talk real fast because 'cause you're not gonna treat my sister like that," you know?
Awesome, awesome. Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
uh, on so, on the topic, one I wanna touch on one thing real quick, because there's so many other things I wanna talk about. Um it's trigger warning for people listening.
Mhm.
Does the Bible ever explicitly condemn sexual assault on women that are unmarried?
No, no,
Right?
we have a law or 2 about a woman who's engaged and a man forces her, and he then needs like, there's one way we handle that, but it's not condemning what he has done to her, it's about her now being defiled, and we've gotta fix that for the father of the woman, make that right for him. It's not about caring about the woman and how she's been treated. We have the reference in Judges 19, a woman who is not
Mhm.
married, but she belongs to a Levite,
Right.
and it is questionable whether or not even he is disturbed by how she's treated.
I don't think
Um,
he was.
I
I
don't
I don't
think
think he
it's hard
was.
to say. It's really hard to say. I tend to read it in the way that you just said. I've had some people push back and say he had at that juncture, he had no power to do otherwise. I'm not oh, yeah, I know, but it was I know, he pushes her out and it's just what is, you know, and I think some
Right.
people wanna say he's depressed in the morning and that's why he barely even notices she's there, you know?
But where did he find her?
I know, he
On the
went to f
doorstep,
I
at the
know,
threshold of the house.
I
Are you
know.
telling me she crawled to the threshold of the house
Yep,
and she
and
never knocked on the door?
right, and he didn't do anything to help her. I know. I agree with you, Justin, and we could even talk about the beginning of that story and how
I
they're
know.
the 2 different traditions of, like, did she cheat on him, which is so ridiculous because she's a concubine. She's literally there to be sex work for
That's
him.
her job.
It is her
Yes.
job for him, and that
Which
she flees
is
to her father, and it takes him multiple months to go get her. Like, come on.
right.
This is
Can
not
we, um
go ahead, can we what?
Is it justified in connecting her concubinage to her being thrown to the wolves?
That is what
Because
go ahead, because what?
what other function does she have?
I mean, that is one of the ways that some scholars read that, that this is, like, not punishment, but it's starting to turn my stomach.
I know. It's
But
it's
but
it's a
here's
lesser crime because that's her
but
function as a
but
concubine.
but that I it's interesting too because I need to take a minute to process what you're saying. Because it is very directly a parallel to Genesis 19,
Yeah,
right? Where, you know, 2 males are being threatened with this, and they are protected beyond belief on that. And God swoops in and protects, you know, the angels. They're actually angels, and so they protect themselves basically. Um, Lot is trying to protect them and yada yada. Um, so the issue what so I kind of my response to your question, honestly, Justin, is kind of two-pieced. One is that a setup in the story, right, to justify this outcome?
Right.
And so all male framework and thinking about things, but isn't it but it is kind of a counter to that Genesis 19, so this is just a really, and the book of Judges itself is all kinds of messed up anyway because they're trying to justify getting a king, and so they're setting up all these
Yes.
stories, right, that are the
They're
leaders.
negative in nature.
Right.
Like they're
Right.
painting the people as being wicked and needing a king.
Exactly. And
Right.
story after story is showing how that is playing out, right? So
Right.
that so Judges is in general is a tough one to turn to for any kind of guidance in life.
I know.
Um, but then back to your original question, are there women who are, I don't like to say sexual assault, but there isn't an alternative because sex is good and assault is bad, and in my mind, but I understand what we're talking about here, what it is. I'd say physical harm involving intimate body parts doesn't just roll off the tongue the way sexual assault does.
Right.
But I'm trying to think of other examples of women who are treated that way and that there's no, I mean, Dinah, right? That's a question of whether or not that was actually
Well,
assault. She's a
where
child, Go ahead. You were gonna say some things.
let's say where was Dinah when Jacob went to go speak with the father of
Right,
Shechem?
right.
She was with him.
Oh, she was?
So
I don't remember that part of the
yeah.
story.
Yeah, after she's raped by, if you believe it was,
According to the
after
story. Mhm.
yeah, after the events transpired with
Right.
Shechem, when he goes to her father goes to talk to Shechem's father, was it
I
Haman?
can't remember. Yeah, maybe.
Um, Dinah is there with them already,
Oh, I don't
which
remember that.
means she had already been taken
Mm.
because she had been defiled. Wasn't her choice.
Or I mean,
Mhm.
so there are all kinds of ways. I think there's an
Yeah,
interesting way
there's
of reading it, which is that he, treats her that way, but the narrative says, "And then he loved her." This is
Mhm.
not the way a rapist responds to something,
Right.
right?
That's the
Um,
opposite of Amnon when he raped
exactly,
Tamar. He
precisely,
hated her after.
precisely, and that
Yeah,
is that is what you see play out.
right,
So, what actually happened? Was she actually game for this interaction? How young was she? Like, there are so
right.
many questions about this, I think, right?
There's some Talmudic voices that says that she was actually behaving wickedly by going out to see the women, the girls, the young women in Shechem, and that she was complicit
She's
in the whole
complicit
thing.
in her it was her fault. What was she wearing? Yeah.
She showed the ankles. Do not show the ankles. Don't do it.
I mean, I like to think that she was enjoying it, enjoying the romance and maybe even the interactions. I don't know, but anyway, so that's questionable, but
Right.
certainly her brothers overreact given that they kill the entire town of men
Oh my god.
in response. I don't know, like, there's
Well,
that, so
but but Simeon and Levi made up for it because after they unalived all the men, they had the wherewithal to kidnap all the women and children and take them back. They didn't just leave them in town to
right,
die and
to
fend for
die.
themselves.
Mhm.
Yeah, which is really odd because just a couple chapters later, when Joseph goes to find his brothers in Shechem, there's people there somehow. Where did the people come from? Just a couple chapters earlier, they killed every living male in Shechem and took all the women and children. I don't
Oh,
get it.
yeah. Well, God's ways are higher than ours, Justin.
Plot holes. There's no plot holes in Genesis ever.
Never. Oh, it's
Okay,
such
so
a powerful question that you posed. When you pose it that way, right? Is there any pushback on an unspoken for or an unmarried taken woman, who has been assaulted? And I think the question itself is really powerful because it needs to be asked, and the answer is troubling, right?
right.
'Cause the one time that there is some sort of, pushback or judgment on it, it's a very sketchy story, and it's really
Mhm.
more about the brothers, I think, y you know,
Yes.
what the thoughts going through their heads about how they treat women versus actually caring about what happened to Dina or Dinah, however you wanna pronounce her name.
Yeah. And somebody like, Richard Elliott Friedman, who people who study, like, the documentary hypothesis, they would say, well, the story of Shechem is really, a Judean narrative about the wickedness of Shechem. It's a political story. nothing to really do with Dinah,
Right.
and I think that's certainly possible.
Totally. Yeah, and that's an easy way to set it up, right? Is
Right,
he violated our sister.
right,
This is an example of their wickedness or whatever.
right, right,
We really don't care how we use women in our narratives because we don't really care what
right.
happens to them. Rah.
And even, uh, I even God himself seems a little bit indifferent. For example, when he remember we already talked about David being punished and the child paying the punishment for
Right.
David's crime.
Right.
But what does Nathan say is gonna happen to David's wives afterwards? He says, "I'm gonna give your wives to your neighbor, and he's gonna sleep with them
Totally.
in
In front
broad
of you.
daylight."
Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
What?
exactly. The women that belong to you are gonna be punished for your doings.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's gross. It's just gross on every level.
right. So,
It's getting
the
worse.
first time I read that, I am not joking. I was in Sunday school with a group
Mm.
of junior high kids. We were
Okay.
talking about the story of David,
Uh-huh.
and we were reading the punishment because every time you read the story of David, you read about how awesome Nathan the prophet came and gave this awesome analogy of this man who only had one little lamb, that and but I remember reading through some of it, trying to refamiliarize myself with the story again, and I got to that part, and I was literally standing in front of these students. I'm like, "Don't read that part. Don't read that part. That's not the part you read out loud." And I was
Were
just
you
like,
saying that inside your head, or were you
in my
actually
head,
saying it
yeah,
out loud? Yeah, you're like, "Oh, oh, don't read that." Oh, yep.
because students are smart. Junior
Yeah,
high
they are.
students will pick up on that, and they're like, "I'm sorry, what?"
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And David does it to I mean, like, people do it happens multiple times. Even it's threatened to David, and then he does it to some people. Like, people are
Mhm.
doing this to each other. Like,
Right,
women are property.
and
Women
it
are property.
happened. I had someone bring this up to me a while ago. They're like, "Oh, this is an empty thread. Didn't really happen." No, it happened. Absalom did.
Oh, right. Absalom did it to his father. That's right. Yep.
What are you
Not his
gonna do?
neighbor, his own son. I mean, that's
Right,
better, right?
right.
I mean, maybe that's what Paul was thinking of over there in First Corinthians 5. He's like, "What do you mean a man is sleeping with his mother stepmother?" Whatever. No, no,
So,
different.
listen, sex in the Bible, sex and marriage
Mm,
in the Bible is
yeah,
a topic there's an endless amount of time we could spend on that topic,
right.
and
There's
maybe we can do a whole session on that.
fodder plenty of fodder for that, yes. Agreed.
I wanna talk a little bit about something less provocative. Let's talk about violence.
You worked on that one, didn't you?
That's in the note cards.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's talk
And
about okay,
you
violence,
said
the
something
language
really
everyone
interesting.
understands. What? Sorry, what? Sorry.
I said you said something really interesting in the book. You kind of, picked out some interesting things. Like, what does it say about God
Mhm,
necessarily that
mhm,
he, like, has his own standing army. Like,
mhm.
he's got a military commander, he's got an army, the most powerful agent in the universe. He could just snap his fingers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, what is it that people wanted to believe about God, right?
Right, right,
And what is it that people are unconsciously internalizing about God or the possibility of what God could do? And certainly people to this day pray to God before battle
right,
and ask or before football game and ask for God to be on their side, right? And to bless them with victory. I mean, you know, soldiers are still given scriptures to like
mhm,
help them calm them when they go into battle. Like this is a thing that
right.
the US government does, right? To give them scriptures that from the Psalms,
Bibles.
from yes, from the Psalms, from
There's the
Bibles.
soldier's Bible.
Right, right. Yeah, and the
Mhm.
passages about God as a warrior, God on your side, all those kinds of things. So what is it we're I mean, there are, what's not Sunday school, but what what's it called in the summer? Oh my god, why am I turning a blank?
Vacation Bible School or
VBS.
VBS, yeah.
Thank you. Oh my god, that was weird. But yeah, there's VBS, you know, stuff that, like, involves camo, like
Yeah,
camo themes, vacation Bible study,
mhm.
vacation Bible schools, like, content and swag and all that stuff. Like, what? the armor of God in the Newer Testament, right?
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
We have no there's no lack of content depicting that God is a warrior on our side until we did something wrong and then he needs to whoop our ass. But yeah.
No, I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that because my next question is, and again, this is another thing I didn't really notice until somebody pointed it out to me, but like the description of God in the Bible, is it a description of a loving father as we like to paint him, or is that like a really like reductionist view of God in the Bible?
Yeah, I do think that's a pretty reductionist view. I think it's wha I mean, that's part of why, I start out this, like, what the Bible is and is not, like, what is it we're expecting this book to actually give us?
Right.
What is it we're expecting it to talk about? Or the hardest thing for most people, right, in the taking the 2 testaments together is that many people are taught that this is, Bible, basic instructions for leaving earth, or this is God's word and love to us, this is who he is. So he in particular, and we need to get on board with it. And I absolutely understand and relate to that, having thought about it that way. But that means that we do then overlook exactly what you just asked, right? We overlook that God is not very kind. God is lacking in problem-solving abilities, right? He's angry that the people he created in Genesis in chapter 6,
Mhm.
he thinks that they are declared to all be just really horrific, which is fascinating because show me any group of people in history who's actually the way they're described. There
Right.
might be some elements to it, but there are also some good in every person.
You need
Um,
that to justify the genocide.
Totally,
Right.
exactly, and
Mhm.
so God, in having created people and then they're terrible, what does he do? He just unalives them all, like, and starts over? Like, that's lacking. We've got some problem you need some better problem-solving
But
skills.
I think the philosophical question is, are we to believe that an all-powerful God, that was his last resort? He had
Exactly,
nothing else he
exactly,
could go to
precisely,
before that?
yeah, that was it, that was your only solution?
Mhm.
Um, where is God described as a loving father? I think that would actually be more interesting. Show me where that is actually described.
Mhm.
Because it isn't ever described God is not actually described that way. In the Newer Testament, when Jesus from time to time refers to God as Father and, all of that stuff, it never goes just the love. You also get the wrath if you're not on board with accepting the love,
Right.
or right, or accepting that Jesus is this son of God, is this essentially son of man, though that language isn't used, the one who is descended from heaven is gonna go back to heaven and be with the Father. Even the God so loved the world in John 3:16 is
Mhm.
followed by 17 and 18, which is really clear about God's wrath against you if you're not on board. So
Yeah, intending that none should perish, right? Am I
right, but if you're not on board, then guess
right.
you've already been judged. You've already been, like, I
Mhm.
mean, show me where there is an actual loving God, compassionate, loving God in the
Mhm.
Bible.
Right.
I'll wait for it, like
Well, I think that's the struggle because the Bible says blanket things like, "Well, God is love," and and that may be true. And Jesus said, He takes care of the lilies of the field and the birds, and how much more will He take care of you? And so,
except
those
I'm
are
working 5 jobs to take care of me.
right. Those are great things to say, but if you observe His actions,
That's right.
what
That's right.
does His actions say? And I think the
Right.
actions speak a different story, right?
Exactly, and, it's interesting. I have 2 books left in me if I have the time on earth to write them, and one is about redefining God, even though I don't need an idea of God personally, but historically speaking, there's a whole range of ways that people have defined God that have nothing to do with the Bible, and they're much more empowering and helpful and productive. So, when people have this conversation about being an atheist or not, like, "Okay, come on, where," which version of God are you asking me if I do or don't believe in? And if it's the one in the Bible, well, then I don't think anyone should believe in that God. Like, I
Mm,
genuinely don't. But there are plenty of people who agree with me and who still believe in God, right? Because they have a different concept of what God is that goes
mhm.
way beyond and is much more in tune with science, for instance, and yada, yada, yada. So that was kind of a tangent, but yeah, the depiction of God in both testaments is problematic, in my opinion. It's not
Yeah,
just that there's a vengeful God in the Hebrew Bible and a loving God in the Newer Testament. I do not think that is true. I think there's love and judgment and wrath in both.
right. No, I agree. Um, on the um, on the topic of violence, I didn't want to get too much
Gotcha.
into
Yep.
the violence of the Old Testament.
Right.
Um,
But
not not
whatever.
not to specifically avoid it, but what is it? What is it? The violent nature of the God of the Old Testament. Um, does that tell us anything about the authors of the text?
It really does, and actually, that's why I was trying to highlight that that chapter is titled "Violence: The Language Everyone Understands,"
Right.
and I don't like that that's true, but I think that that's an important thing to point out, and as I do at the beginning of the chapter, like, I ask people to think through violence scenarios, or when is violence invoked, or when is it used? Is there ever a time when violence is helpful? Is violence ever justified? And I don't mean just war conversations. I
Mhm.
just mean within relationships, and I think it's helpful to start there instead of looking at all this horrificness in the Bible. Like, start with what you know, what you do and do not tolerate in your own relationships, and
Mhm.
maybe you need to get some therapy over that. I say kiddingly and also very seriously. Um, People who grew up in an abusive home or a home with abusive relationships tend to are drawn to those because that's what they know instead of understanding that there's something more loving beyond that. So thinking about that element of human interactions and then go into and look at these and then think about, yeah, well, what is this telling us? Precisely your question. I mean, your question tends to be that also has the answer within it, I think, on that one, because
I do a lot of that 'cause I debate people a lot, and
gotcha. Yep.
you have to do sorry, it's a habit, I do trap questions. You know what trap questions are?
I think so. I think you mean like, yeah. And that's fine. It's fine.
Mm,
But it's also, yeah, like what it does, I do think, and that, back to one of your earlier questions, I think, Justin, what is it that's shifting from thinking about, looking at Genesis 1 through 11 as myth instead of history? What shifts? And then that then begins to apply to everything. It's not just the first 11 chapters, it's everything. What does the telling of this particular narrative, the conquering of Canaan,
mhm.
whichever narrative you wanna choose, what is going on there? What did people need? And it's predominantly being written by men, and the
Yes.
people trying to lead these people or manage or take care of or whatever, and yeah, what did they need? Why would they want a narrative being written with this retrospective, right, about the conquering of Canaan? Like, why did they need a narrative that says that they did this to people already living there, which in reality, they were their neighbors because they were already living there and they were trying to separate themselves, distinguish themselves, and blah blah blah. Like, well, yeah,
Yeah.
what are these scriptures? And take your pick. It's not just the narratives that involve violence. Right, but yes,
Mhm.
the viol and even the Psalms, that's what really started
Oh,
to bother me is
I
I
know.
really liked the Psalms. I did a Psalm seminar in seminary, and then I did one in graduate school. I was like, "Holy crap, there's a
Until you
lot
get
of
to, like
vengeance." Even not
yes.
even the one about smashing the babies' heads, but, like,
Yeah.
which is awful enough, right? But, like, all the time, look at what the Psalms of David, go read those and how much
Mhm.
vengeance and
Mhm.
conquering and victoriousness and all that. I get it, right? Historical context, they needed a god that was on their side, you know,
Yeah.
but
Uh,
it's yeah, and then it perpetuates the need for that and the need for that kind of dynamic and the dominant framework idea of people and relationships if you're not actually critically thinking about this instead of agreeing with it and seeing that this is the way humans need to interact. Like, no, it's not. But it's what we've
Yeah,
been told.
that's a really good point, and some people have done a good job about compartmentalizing the violence of the Old Testament, saying, "Well, it was necessary for the time period, it's not necessary now." But is that if you're just reading the text at face value, is that a justifiable compartmentalization, or is that a rationalization for saying, "Well, God can get away with it even though we shouldn't be doing it today?"
Well, I think part of me wants to go instead. I mean, I think that's an you're still reading it. Like, it's still
Right.
in your Bible.
I know.
So it's still informing the way you're thinking.
Yeah,
And the flip of that for me is, let's talk about some of Paul's language because his rhetoric is it's so antagonistic. It is so
right.
negative. It is so divisive. He has a serious narcissism issue.
I
And
agree.
right? And so I see a lot of violence in his language. I don't think it's just a Hebrew Bible thing, and it's not just the wrath of God that's implied on the flip side of the love of
Mhm.
God in John 3. It's in Jesus's words, it's in Paul's words, it's in, you know, the judging, like, when he says to hand someone over to Satan to be taken care, like, what the hell? Like,
Yeah.
it's very dualistic thinking, in my opinion, and so much just asserting that this is it, and all that would go behind trying to say, "I'm correct, not these people who've come along behind me. You need to believe my message, so to me, there's an element of violence in Paul's writings as well that people that Christian communities, that church ideas and beliefs are founded upon.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so antagonism and animosity is a part.
Well, you mentioned it in the latter portion, almost the very end of the book, fittingly, um, about some of the dualism and the functionality of apocalyptical literature and things like that. And I think it still kind of plays in well with this idea of vengeance and judgment and
That's right.
things like that.
That's right.
And I think anyone reading it from a historical perspective can see that the apocalyptic literature is it fair to say I don't wanna say it was necessary for the people of the time period, but is it fair to say that it satisfied, a political and mental and emotional need of the people?
I would say it satisfied a mental, emotional, political need of some of the people. I don't think
Right.
that everybody finds apocalyptic literature useful then or now. I cannot stand it. I have never liked it, right?
I hate
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, but some people vibe with it, like, not
Mhm,
because they want this to play out, but it works for them in a way that I just can't get on board with, and I'm okay with that, and I'm okay
mhm,
with them actually wanting to work with these texts, right? So I think the
mhm,
whoever wrote the Book of Revelation, um, was venting in ways that I think
mhm.
it was helpful for him, and I think there were other Jews who would have identified with it. I just interviewed Lynn Huber last week talking about the Book of Revelation, and she shared some things I hadn't considered before or hadn't been exposed to before, and I really enjoyed that conversation with her. But that was one of them. Is that I had read scholarship that said that, the island of Patmos was a political prisoner camp or whatever. There's actually no evidence to support that. And so yeah, you're like, "Nope, I already knew that." And, and she's talking about how it's, perhaps then it really is more about the destruction of the temple and how that has the anger and the frustration over that, even if it is 20 some years later, so all the different ruminations and things. So yeah, that makes it even more about being a
Mhm.
catharsis for him and other Jews who might be identifying with this.
Right.
And I think it's pretty understandable if you have had, I mean, if you to put it in our current terms, it is similar to, unfortunately, the people at Waco, because the
Yeah.
government over that group of people came in and destroyed their world.
Right.
That regardless of their beliefs, that is trippy, right?
Right.
You've got your own government coming in and destroying your lives, the people you love. How many survived that? 2 or something?
Yes, there weren't many.
Yeah, and there were 84. I knew there were 84 who were unalived. But so like to and I don't wanna talk about the ideologies of the 2 groups as if I'm comparing them, but I'm right, just to say
Mhm.
this was a massive thing. It was a 4-year battle, and there's some animosity there. So
So, you know the answer to the question, but I want you to give a full response because what what's the purpose of apocalyptic literature?
yeah, it's to give hope to the underdog. That's the, like, 10-word version, or however many words that was. It's about people who are being who who experience life that they are being persecuted, they are being there's an element of utter
Mhm.
unjust oppression, persecution going on here, and historically speaking, at the hands of the people leading them, and that's a really important thing to me. This isn't about religious groups fighting, and it's not about it's because you worship Jesus that you're being persecuted. No, that's not what's going on. This is
Right.
political,
Right.
and you cannot imagine that this is going to be rectified in this lifetime because it can't be. You are powerless in this
Look around
situation.
you.
You are powerless. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you believe that there is a God of justice, then this has to end well at some point for us. And
Right.
so we're going to imagine that God is going to come down from the heavenly realm and actually come in and wipe out our enemies and start over. Set
Right.
up a just government, set up just powers, and that will be of God. So that's where this kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven kind of on
Renewed
earth,
heaven, renewed
all
earth,
here
everything is
on
made
earth.
right.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
all here on earth. It's not the destruction of the planet and all that. No, this is about people wanting to believe that it's possible somehow for God to actually come in and save the day and start over. That is a group of people, whether it's true or not, who feel very disenfranchised, right?
Mhm.
This is about power and politics. And there is an element of the behaviors of the people that are leading to this persecution, but it's about
Right.
politics, right? If followers of the Christ or followers of the way are being true to that, then they are honoring Christ in the way they should be honoring the emperor, and they're not honoring the emperor, which pulls up all this political suspicion. So it doesn't even have to be top down, the government on high persecuting them. It could be very similar to what happened to people who look like they're from the Near East after 9/11. It's
Right.
very much a communal, like, suspicion that is absolutely unfounded,
Right.
but that it's already taken off. The suspicion is there, and it's like a
Mm.
virus, and so and it just destroys lives. So, historically speaking, apocalyptic literature is about giving hope to sustain the people through the struggle.
Right.
Absolutely nothing about what's actually gonna play out, but it's a vision of something that gives you hope. That's
Right.
it. And this is where, by the way, this is where the concept of this punishing after this life starts to work in its way into Jewish thought. And this is
Yep.
where the concept of hell starts to take root in Jewish thought. It starts with this need for your enemies to be punished. And if it's not happening in this lifetime, it's going to happen after. And that's when hell.
Yes.
And then when I first discovered that about hell, I'm like, oh my God, this is so ridiculous, right?
And the Talmud comments on like the earliest portions of the if you go like to the Mishnah, right? It comments a little bit on their conceptions of what they think the
Huh,
punishment is
huh,
going to be. And
interesting.
some of them would even say, like, when they talk about being, punished in the fires of Gehenna as an idiom for hell or Hades or whatever, some of them say, "No, it's just for 12 months. It's fine, it's only for 12 months, not a problem." Because nobody sins so bad that you need more than 12 months of being, tormented by flames.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
But
Yeah.
it does develop, as you say, within, Judaism, especially during the periods of subjugation, and because
Exactly. Yeah.
um and that kind of brings in another topic about apocalyptic literature. How important is it that when we read the apocalyptic literature, um all of them have this slogan, just hold on a little bit longer.
Right.
What the thing that we're hoping is going to happen is happening soon,
It'll
very
be very
soon.
soon. Yeah.
Just a little bit longer,
She
right?
can't handle it for much longer. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Does
Yes.
that message work to a people like the Holy Roman Empire that's now in charge? Does that message have any weight? When you're the top dog, do apocalyptic literature matter to you at all?
Oh, 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 oh. No, and I mean, I think that's an interesting question because and people do debate that, like, was
Mhm.
this code that the Romans didn't understand? Like, that's ridiculous. I mean, they're intelligent people. Um,
Yeah.
but how much did they worry about it? That's a great question,
Mhm,
and I don't have any framework to work with here to assess that.
mhm,
Like, I think because there are efforts to squash movements,
mhm,
and so if there's a movement that this literature is leading to, then we're gonna
mhm.
get on that, but we're not gonna worry
Right,
about what the peasants are,
right.
how they
It's
entertain
for the
themselves.
peasants.
Mhm.
I forget if it was F.S. Bruce in his one of his histories or if it was somebody else, but somebody had made the mention that, the classification of the Sadducees was one of an upper tier typically. You were on the top of the food chain
Mhm,
politically,
mhm. I think
and
so.
he says that certainly could have played into the reason why they just other than the fact that they didn't accept the prophets, right? It certainly could have played into the idea that, well, the idea of the afterlife,
Right.
not that important, right?
Not we don't really care about that. Yep. No,
Right.
I think that's a helpful nugget, right? That explains why they didn't care about this. It did not factor into their worldview.
Mhm.
They were the people that others wanted to have punished, so why would they
Right. Right. We don't wanna
Yeah,
go to
it
the fires
doesn't
of
make
hell.
sense to me. Yeah, I don't have a need when I'm
Okay,
Yes,
I gotta I've we're not gonna get through all the questions, 'cause I've got so many.
yes, and
But I want to end on a topic that I know that you're passionate about, which is the virgin birth, which you
Indeed, indeed, I am passionate about that one.
so can you maybe give a background, like, where did this concept how did the concept arise? Because if you just read Isaiah, chapter 7, the whole chapter, you don't I never got the impression that this was about a virgin who's gonna give birth.
Exactly. That is exactly right. That isn't about a virgin who's about to give birth. It's about a young woman who is already pregnant. Yes.
Right.
And the language is a young woman. They did not use the language for a virgin. So there are two different pieces to answer your question. One is where did this come from in the Christian tradition? And that's where it comes from that Alma is the language for a young woman, and that's what's being used here in Isaiah 7. There's a young woman who is pregnant, and by the time that child is XYZ, then this is, so not too long in the
Mhm.
future. The peoples around you that you're terrified of are not even going to exist anymore. So just chill.
Right.
That's the comment in Isaiah 7. And if the trick is, or the key here is that the word for if what men were trying to talk about was a woman whose body has not been penetrated yet by a penis, that woman is a bitula, right? Bitula, right?
Yes.
And so those are two different descriptors of a female. And into Greek, they both use parthenos, or they are both translated into
Right.
Greek with one word, which is parthenos. And so, yes, should hear some sort of resonance around Parthenon and blah blah blah. Athena and the goddess of virginity, all these different
Mhm.
things. But so Parthenos is then what is used in Matthew chapter 1:18 when it's talking about this, a young woman shall be born of, a virgin shall conceive and yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, so the question really is, why do translators use choose to translate Parthenon there as virgin instead of young woman? Because both are up for grabs. Both are legit in that taking that Greek passage and putting it into English, you can choose either one. And so it could just say a young woman instead of a virgin. So there are multiple pieces to this, actually, in my opinion, in terms of why the church, why a translation committee in the middle of the 20th century would choose that language. And so more than we can get into, but there are multiple pieces to the idea of the virgin birth within Christian tradition and Christian doctrine, and it takes several centuries for that to develop. So that, for me, just some sort of basic baseline, that's important information, in my opinion. It isn't something that was there from the get-go. It's something that took
Right.
place over time. It is an issue that the emperor Constantine said, "You guys need to stop fighting over this and come to a decision." The emperor called the first ecumenical council, as I'm sure you know, Justin, but for those watching, like, it's kind of interesting that it's political even at that. Like,
Right.
the very first defining of doctrine was motivated by a politician. Like,
It
I
really
don't want
was.
yeah, I don't want these the arguing about this theology to split my empire, so get together and figure it out. So, why that she needed to be a virgin in order to have Jesus and all the stuff, and then sex and sin and all those things combined. So it's like all kinds of big topics come together in this. But also historically speaking, when you talked about when people did, it's not like Jesus. This was, the first time I heard this blew my mind. I'm like, what do you mean Jesus is an only person who was thought to be born of a virgin? So when, like, what?
I mean,
He's special.
in
Everything
all
about him is special.
ancient literature, there's never been anyone else. You sure about
No,
that?
right? What? What? No, 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 no. Yeah. So when people said that, historically speaking, it was a way to indicate that the child that was born of this special insemination, um, right, this child is special. This child, we're trying to say
Right.
something important about the child. And
Like
my
like
first,
Moses floating in the basket. Are we to
yeah,
believe Moses was put into the Nile River, or do we interpret this as tapping into the Sargon epic?
exactly, precisely. And the first time I experienced it was when I read through the Iliad and
Right.
saw that they used to call, someone who they didn't know who his father was, did something brave in battle, then they're calling him a son of a god. And so only, so it's this ancient idea that's out there, and Christian tradition made a very special thing of the virginity piece in a way that others didn't. Other traditions who had the leader of this group of people, the mother was impregnated by a god. uh, Others didn't make a big deal of her virginal status prior to that insemination, right? And pregnancy. So that probably, I don't know if that was even helpful.
No, no, it is, but it leads to a really interesting question. Is it necessary to believe in a virgin birth, or is that a requirement for the faith somehow?
Well, I think that depends on who you ask, because it is an element of the doctrines. So, technically speaking, to be orthodox with a lowercase o, you do need to believe in the virginal birth. Now, how do people interpret that concept? Do people mean that she had not been penetrated and was miraculously impregnated? Or do they actually take that on in this kind of metaphorical way? Do people today, and I would say it's very few, but there may be some people who say, "This is how I can justify being a part of this community, is when I say I believe in the virgin birth, I'm thinking of the ancient like the ancient meaning behind that this is a special pregnancy, and I'm just gonna roll with that." But I don't think there's that many people who think about it that way. So technically, yes, you do need to say yes to that tenet of the Christian doctrine to be Christian, but there are plenty of people who don't believe in the virgin birth who still call themselves Christian. So what do you do with that?
Right.
Right?
Right. And as far as I can tell, the virgin birth is important to Pauline doctrine.
For sure.
Like the ideas of original sin and things like that. Can you kind of elucidate what what the virgin birth has to do with original sin or impurity or things like that? Because if Jesus is like our sacrifice, like all these ideas are connected. Can you put some substance to that? Like why the virgin birth seemed to be important for the doctrines of the New Testament?
Mm, goodness. Yeah, that's okay. I'll do my best, um, in just a couple minutes, right? Because I so there are 2 chapters that talk about this
Right.
issue, and one is at the end of so chapter 3 is titled "What Really Happened in the Garden." Not that I know what actually really happened, but I just want people to think about it. And the end of that chapter, I talk about the way some of the church fathers read Genesis 3, and it does start with Paul. It does start with Paul's misreading of Genesis 3, and then they build on these ideas and excuse me. So so early on, some of these church fathers would read into the garden story that when the female was deceived, which is not I don't think actually the serpent is actually deceiving the female. I think he's actually having a conversation with her and he points out the obvious. I don't think
The
it's
serpent never
deception.
lied.
The serpent doesn't lie. If anyone lies, it's God back in
Yeah.
chapter 2. Yeah.
Yeah. Because the serpent only says your eyes will be open and you'll be like God. And
Like
in
us.
the chapter, what happens? They've become like one of us.
Like
Their eyes
us.
been open.
Yeah, right. Like,
Right.
it's not and in the ancient Near East, serpents were associated with knowledge and with the divine, right? So this is a
Right.
normal thing to have happen in the story. But because of the way Paul then misreads it, or the church fathers start doing that as well, and they talk about deception, they talk about the first woman having then how would she get the man on board with this? And so the assumptions and the things being read on is that she seduced him into a to also partaking of the fruit, and there's really interesting language around this in terms of the way they talk about s you know, and then, of course, this now that they have both partaken of the fruit, that this is a fall, that this is they have sinned because they disobeyed
Mhm.
God. God's word in chapter 2 was to not do this, and they did it. And so a heavy interpretation of this being a disobedience
Right.
instead of being about something much bigger and much looser than that. And so disobedience, sin becomes read onto it because Jews don't read this as about sin. I mean, it's just funny. And then what else do we get? And then we get this all this different language around the the idea of the serpent potentially being Satan, but this idea of the serpent it- the there are so many readings I wish I could have included for people to see. That so these different elements of like not unrest, but just not being satisfied with their plight in life, and that's why the serpents, was sneaky and did all this stuff. So all these different elements of language that sounds like sinfulness is all being put into it. And then if you go from that to believing that the way that this sinfulness then is passed along, and it has been, is because you have children. Like, you pass it along. They did this thing. They made a disobedient choice, and now they are infected with it, and they pass it along through to their children. So then the conversation comes up, how does that happen? Well, it happens by the man contributing his part, and historically, we think that they seem to think that all that the woman contributed was an incubator, no concept of egg, right? Egg and sperm. And so
Yeah,
the ma
she's just the receptacle for the seed,
right.
right?
And
Yeah.
so yes, he contributes through his semen, and she contributes by being the vessel in which the child develops. And so you have 2 sinful people contributing to the production of this child. That is how then children are born with original sin, is they've been contributed to by both parents. So, if you are going to have Jesus as a perfect sacrifice, modeled after the animal sacrifices in Leviticus, without blemish, then you can't have a female who is with blemish. giving birth, like, as a like, you have to have a special vessel uh, for that child to develop within. What's interesting is initially that's taken to be that she simply hasn't been penetrated by a man, and therefore she isn't defiled, but pretty quickly some guys realize, "No, that's not actually what we're talking about. We're talking about she needs to be special," and that's where the immaculate conception comes in, not the virginal birth. Immaculate conception is about Mary having been conceived in a special way so that she comes out not having been tainted by sin, not
Right. Because
said specific. Go ahead.
it's not just good enough that Jesus is born sinless.
Right.
We have
Well,
to find a way to justify that he's, like, deified somehow.
yes, and people were saying realizing that their logic was falling apart, right? That if both parents contribute to the sinfulness of the child, God covers the male because he's, of course, sinless, but she's still like, she's still a sinful person, and so how do we make this woman, Mary, not sinful? Well, we're gonna have her have a special birth, and her mother, Anna, actually is impregnated in a special way so that she's special, but then you gotta if you follow the logic, you have to keep going back and back, like, it doesn't ever end. But that's why the story, the doctrine of Immaculate Conception is actually about Mary herself being conceived miraculously. She was dedicated to the temple. She did not touch the floor of the temple until she started having her menstruation. And that's when she's purchased by Joseph. And there's even at the end of this story, there's still even this element about the faulty thoughts around the hymen and whether or not she was still intact after delivering Jesus. So all kinds of stuff. But all of that is in this idea about protecting or believing in Jesus being born without original sin so that he can be the one to be this animal sacrifice for everyone else's sin. How was that?
That's exactly what I was looking for. Because I had a line, circled in the book, says the only way to have a human born without sin was to leave out sex, or leave sex out of the equation, as so the thinking goes. But Dr. Bird, I really appreciate all the time you give me. I feel like there's a lot more we could talk about, but I want to say, guys, if you haven't grabbed, permission granted, I highly encourage you to do so. There's a lot of meat on the bone here. This is a really good book. And I think not only that, I noticed there's a lot of things in here that are going to open the door to topics that maybe people haven't considered yet. And I
Thank you.
think that's really a critical role. That's something that we experienced in school, but people in the church don't necessarily experience. They never have those doors opened, and they're never encouraged to ask the questions. And I feel like you're encouraging them to ask the questions, which is what we need.
Thank you. Thank you. And just FYI, I also did the reading for the Audible version. If people are
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, so Audible version for those
Mhm.
who are book
Or
averse, who
yeah.
who don't.
Or prefer to listen while they're doing other things. Yeah.
That's right. Definitely, yeah, I would recommend Audible, especially for road trips. That's a good way to get some books in.
Mhm.
Um, but Dr. Bird, I really appreciate you. You've been here for almost 3 hours now, so I really appreciate you tolerating me for that long. Most people can't.
Well, no, that's not a question at all. I appreciate you having me on to have this conversation. I really do.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know, Dr. Bird is on YouTube and she is on TikTok. I'm going to have both of her links in the description of this video so you can go find her. And you've got 2 books out currently, is that correct?
I have 3.
Or
My
3?
dissertation
Okay.
is published, but
Okay,
it's a dense read. It's not for general reader.
those are for those of us who can afford to buy something from Brill.
Exactly. Yeah. I've asked for the rights to do the audio for that actually, because I'd like to do that,
That'd
but
be
anyway,
awesome.
yeah. But
So
yeah,
anyways, I really encourage all the viewers to check out Dr. Bird's books, subscribe to her on social medias.
thank you.
Is there anything else that you're working on that people should be notified of?
I am currently working on the audio for my most recent book. I'm just gonna pull it up real quick. The Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? So that's my most recent book that we were referring to. I am working on the audio for that. I'm also working on some like some courses that you could do one, one video at a time if you're interested in the content kind of thing. But they add up to similar to what this book is, but in video form. Anyway, so that's what I'm working on. Are some courses
Very
that people
good.
can do. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bird. I hope we can talk again in the
Thank
future.
you. Yes.
And
You have
is
a
there you have a website as well,
I
right?
do. JenniferGraceBird.com is the best.
That's
It's
what I
the
thought.
easiest way to get to all the things that I do because they're all linked there.
Exactly. So if there's further questions, definitely go to
Yes. Yes.
jennifergracebird.com.
Thank you.
You get your CV up there too for people who have questions. Okay, because
Put
that
it on
always
the
comes
desk.
up. She's not a fake. She's not some liberal scam scholar.
Yeah, no, I've put some time in. Put some time in. Try to be
But
respectful. Legit.
thank you so much for sharing with us. I really appreciate it.